Section 176 of Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rhonda Fetterman. Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 176. The Farmer and the Moneylender. There was once a farmer who suffered much at the hands of a moneylender. Good harvests or bad, the farmer was always poor, the moneylender rich. At the last, when he hadn't a farthing left, the farmer went to the moneylender's house and said, "You can't squeeze water from a stone, and as you have nothing to get by me now, you might tell me the secret of becoming rich." "My friend," returned the moneylender piously, "riches come from Ram. Ask him." "Thank you, I will," replied the simple farmer. So he prepared 3 girdle cakes to last him on the journey, and set out to find Ram. First he met a Brahmin, and to him he gave a cake, asking him to point out the road to Ram. But the Brahmin only took the cake and went on his way, without a word. Next the farmer met a yogi, or devotee, and to him he gave a cake, without receiving any help in return. At last he came upon a poor man sitting under a tree, and finding out he was hungry, the kindly farmer gave him his last cake, and sitting down to rest beside him, entered into conversation. "And where are you going?" asked the poor man at length. "Oh, I have a long journey before me, for I am going to find Ram," replied the farmer. "I don't suppose you could tell me which way to go." "Perhaps I can," said the poor man, smiling, "for I am Ram. What do you want of me?" Then the farmer told the whole story, and Ram, taking pity on him, gave him a conch shell and showed him how to blow it in a particular way, saying, "Remember, whatever you wish for, you have only to blow the conch that way, and your wish will be fulfilled. Only have a care of that moneylender, for even magic is not proof against his wiles." The farmer went back to his village rejoicing. In fact, the moneylender noticed his high spirits at once, and said to himself, "Some good fortune must have befallen the stupid fellow, to make him hold his head so jauntily." Therefore he went over to the simple farmer's house, and congratulated him on his good fortune in such cunning words, pretending to have heard all about it, that before long the farmer found himself telling the whole story, all except the secret of blowing the conch, for with all his simplicity, the farmer was not quite such a fool as to tell that. Nevertheless, the moneylender determined to have the conch by hook or by crook, and as he was villain enough not to stick at trifles, he waited for a favorable opportunity and stole the conch. But after nearly bursting himself with blowing the conch in every conceivable way, he was obliged to give up the secret as a bad job. However, being determined to succeed, he went back to the farmer and said coolly, "Look here, I've got your conch, but I can't use it. You haven't got it, so it's clear you can't use it either. Business is at a standstill unless we make a bargain. Now, I promise to give you back your conch, and never to interfere with your using it, on one condition, which is this: whatever you get from it, I am to get double." "Never!" cried the farmer. "That would be the old business all over again." "Not at all," replied the wily moneylender. "You will have your share. Now, don't be a dog in the manger, for if you get all you want, what could it matter to you if I am rich or poor?" At last, though it went sorely against the grain to be of any benefit to a moneylender, the farmer was forced to yield, and from that time, no matter what he gained by power of the conch, the money-lender gained double, and the knowledge that this was so preyed upon the farmer's mind day and night, so that he had no satisfaction out of anything. At last there came a very dry season, so dry that the farmer's crops withered for want of rain. Then he blew his conch, and wished for a well to water them, and lo! there was the well. But the money-lender had two beautiful new wells. This was too much for any farmer to stand, and our friend brooded over it, and brooded over it, till at last a bright idea came into his head. He seized the conch, blew it loudly, and cried out, "O Ram, I wish to be blind of one eye." And so he was, in a twinkling, but the money-lender, of course, was blind of both, and in trying to steer his way between the two new wells he fell into one, and was drowned. Now, this true story shows that a farmer once got the better of a money-lender, but only by losing one of his eyes. End of section 176. Recording by Rhonda Fetterman.
Section 177 of Childhood Favorites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ralph Snelson. Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 177. Tit for Tat. There once lived a camel and a jackal who were great friends. One day the jackal said to the camel, "I know that there is a fine field of sugar cane on the other side of the river. If you will take me across, I'll show you the place. This plan will suit me as well as you. You will enjoy eating the sugar cane, and I am sure to find many crabs' bones and bits of fish by the riverside on which to make a good dinner." The camel consented, and swam across the river, taking the jackal, who could not swim, on his back. When they reached the other side, the camel went to eating the sugar cane, and the jackal ran up and down the river bank, devouring all the crabs, bits of fish, and bones he could find. But being a much smaller animal, he had made an excellent meal before the camel had eaten more than 2 or 3 mouthfuls. And no sooner had he finished his dinner than he ran round and round the sugar-cane field, yelping and howling with all his might. The villagers heard him, and thought, "There is a jackal among the sugar-canes. He will be scratching holes in the ground and spoiling the roots of the plants." And they all went down to the place to drive him away. But when they got there, they found to their surprise not only a jackal, but a camel who was eating the sugar-canes. This made them very angry, and they caught the poor camel and drove him from the field, and beat him until he was nearly dead. When they had gone, the jackal said to the camel, "We had better go home." And the camel said, "Very well, then jump upon my back as you did before." So the jackal jumped upon the camel's back, and the camel began to recross the river. When they had got well into the water, the camel said, "This is a pretty way in which you have treated me, friend jackal. No sooner had you finished your own dinner than you must go yelping about the place loud enough to arouse the whole village, and bring all the villagers down to beat me black and blue, and turn me out of the field before I had eaten 2 mouthfuls. What in the world did you make such a noise for?" "I don't know," said the jackal. "It's a custom I have. I always like to sing a little after dinner." The camel waded on through the river. The water reached up to his knees, then above them, up, 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 higher and higher, until he was obliged to swim. Then, turning to the jackal, he said, "I feel very anxious to row." "Oh, pray don't. Why do you wish to do so?" asked the jackal. "I don't know," answered the camel. "It is a custom I have. I always like to have a little roll after dinner." So saying, he rolled over in the water, shaking the Jackal off as he did so, and the Jackal was drowned, but the camel swam safely ashore. End of section 177. Section 178 of Childhood Favorites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ralph Snelson. Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 178. Singh, Rajah and the Cunning Little Jackals. Once upon a time, in a great jungle, there lived a great lion. He was Rajah of all the country round, and every day he used to leave his den in the deepest shadow of the rocks and roar with a loud, angry voice. And when he roared, the other animals in the jungle, who were all his subjects, got very much frightened and ran here and there, and Singh Rajah would pounce upon them and kill them and gobble them up for his dinner. This went on for a long, long time, until at last there were no living creatures left in the jungle but two little jackals, a Rajah jackal and a Renee jackal, husband and wife. A very hard time of it the poor little jackals had, running this way and that to escape the terrible Singh Rajah, and every day the little Renee jackal would say to her husband, "I am afraid he will catch us today. Do you hear how he is roaring? Oh dear, oh dear!" And he would answer her, "Never fear, I will take care of you. Let us run on a mile or two. Come, come, quick, quick, quick!" And they would both run away as fast as they could. After some time spent in this way, they found, however, one fine day, that the lion was so close upon them that they could not escape. Then the little Renee jackal said, "Husband, husband, I feel much frightened. The Singh Rajah is so angry he will certainly kill us at once. What can we do?" But he answered, "Cheer up, we can save ourselves yet. Come, and I'll show you how we may manage it." So what did these cunning little jackals do but they went to the great lion's den, and when he saw them coming, he began to roar and shake his mane, and he said, "You little wretches, come and be eaten at once. I have had no dinner for 3 whole days, and all that time I have been running over hill and dale to find you. Roar, roar! Come and be eaten, I say." And he lashed his tail and gnashed his teeth and looked very terrible indeed. Then the Jackal Rajah, creeping quite close up to him, said, "O great Singh Rajah, we all know you are our master, and we would have come at your bidding long ago. But indeed, sir, there is a much bigger Rajah even than you in this jungle, and he tried to catch hold of us and eat us up, and frighten us so much that we were obliged to run away." "What do you mean?" growled Singh Rajah. "There is no king in this jungle but me." "Ah, sire," answered the Jackal, "in truth one would think so, for you are very dreadful. Your very voice is death. But it is as we say, for we with our own eyes have seen one with whom you could not compete, whose equal you can no more be than we are yours, whose face is as flaming fire, his step as thunder, and his power supreme." "It is impossible," interrupted the old lion. "But show me this Rajah of whom you speak so much, that I may destroy him instantly." Then the little jackals ran on before him until they reached a great well, and pointing down to his own reflection in the water, they said, "See, sire, there lives the terrible king of whom we spoke." When Singh Rajah looked down the well, he became very angry, for he thought he saw another lion there. He roared and shook his great mane, and the shadow lion shook his and looked terribly defiant. At last, beside himself with rage at the violence of his opponent, Singh Rajah sprang down to kill him at once. But no other lion was there, only the treacherous reflection, and the sides of the well were so steep that he could not get out again to punish the two jackals, who peeped over the top. After struggling for some time in the deep water, he sank, to rise no more, and the little jackals threw stones down upon him from above, and danced round and round the well, singing, "Ayo, ayo, 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 the king of the forest is dead, is dead. We have killed the great lion who would have killed us. Ayo, 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 ayo. Ring-a-ting, ding-a-ting, ring-a-ting, ding-a-ting, ayo, ayo, ayo." End of section 178.
Section 179 of Childhood's Favorites in Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rhonda Fetterman. Childhood's Favorites in Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 179. The White Stone Canoe, adapted by H.R. Schoolcraft. There was once a very beautiful Indian maiden, who died suddenly on the day she was to have been married to a handsome young warrior. He was also brave, but his heart was not proof against this loss. From the hour she was buried, there was no more joy or peace for him. He went often to visit the spot where the women had buried her, and sat musing there, when it was thought by some of his friends he would have done better to try to amuse himself in the chase, or by diverting his thoughts in the war-path. But war and hunting had both lost their charms for him. His heart was already dead within him. He pushed aside both his war-club and his bow and arrows. He had heard the old people say that there was a path that led to the land of souls, and he determined to follow it. He accordingly set out one morning after having completed his preparations for the journey. At first he hardly knew which way to go. He was only guided by the tradition that he must go south. For a while he could see no change in the face of the country. Forests and hills and valleys and streams had the same look which they wore in his native place. There was snow on the ground when he set out, and it was sometimes seen to be piled and matted on the thick trees and bushes. At length it began to diminish, and finally disappeared. The forest assumed a more cheerful appearance, the leaves put forth their buds, and before he was aware of the completeness of the change, he found himself surrounded by spring. He had left behind him the land of snow and ice. The air became mild, the dark clouds of winter had rolled away from the sky. A pure field of blue was above him, and as he went he saw flowers beside his path, and heard the songs of birds. By these signs he knew he was going the right way, for they agreed with the traditions of his tribe. At length he spied a path. It led him through a grove, then up a long and elevated ridge, on the very top of which he came to a lodge. At the door stood an old man, with white hair, whose eyes, though deeply sunk, had a fiery brilliance. He had a long robe of skins thrown loosely around his shoulders, and a staff in his hands. The young Chippewayan began to tell his story, but the venerable chief arrested him before he had proceeded to speak 10 words. "I have expected you," he replied, "and had just risen to bid you welcome to my abode. She whom you seek passed here but a few days since, and being fatigued with her journey, rested herself here. Enter my lodge and be seated, and I will then satisfy your inquiries and give you directions for your journey from this point." Having done this, they both issued forth to the lodge door. "You see yonder gulf," said he. and the wide stretching blue plains beyond? It is the land of souls. You stand upon its borders, and my lodge is the gate of entrance. But you cannot take your body along. Leave it here with your bow and arrows, your bundle, and your dog. You will find them safe on your return." So saying, he re-entered the lodge, and the freed traveler bounded forward as if his feet had suddenly been endowed with the power of wings. But all things retained their natural colors and shapes. The woods and leaves and streams and lakes were only more bright and comely than he had ever witnessed. Animals bounded across his path with a freedom and a confidence which seemed to tell him there was no blood shed here. Birds of beautiful plumage inhabited the groves and sported in the waters. There was but one thing in which he saw a very unusual effect. He noticed that his passage was not stopped by trees or other objects. He appeared to walk directly through them. They were, in fact, but the souls or shadows of material trees. He became sensible that he was in a land of shadows. When he had traveled half a day's journey through a country which was continually becoming more attractive, he came to the banks of a broad lake, in the center of which was a large and beautiful island. He found a canoe of shining white stone tied to the shore. He was now sure that he had taken the right path, for the aged man had told him this. There were also shining paddles. He immediately entered the canoe and took the paddles in his hands, when to his joy and surprise, on turning round, he beheld the object of his search in another canoe, exactly its counterpart in everything. She had exactly imitated his motions, and they were side by side. They at once pushed out from shore and began to cross the lake. Its waves seemed to be rising, and at a distance looked ready to swallow them up. But just as they entered the whitened edge of them, they seemed to melt away, as if they were but the images of waves. But no sooner was one wreath of foam past than another, more threatening still, arose. Thus they were in perpetual fear, and what added to it was the clearness of the water, through which they could see heaps of beings who had perished before, and whose bones lay strewed on the bottom of the lake. The Master of Life had, however, decreed to let them pass, for the actions of neither of them had been bad. But they saw many others struggling and sinking in the waves. Old and young of all ages and ranks were there. Some passed, and some sank. It was only the little children whose canoes seemed to meet no waves. At length every difficulty was gone as in a moment, and they both leaped out on the happy island. They felt that the very air was food. It strengthened and nourished them. They wandered together over the blissful fields, where everything was formed to please the eye and the ear. There were no tempests. There was no ice, no chilly winds. No one shivered for the want of warm clothes. No one suffered hunger. No one mourned for the dead. They saw no graves. They heard of no wars. There was no hunting of animals, for the air itself was their food. Gladly would the young warrior have remained there forever, but he was obliged to go back for his body. He did not see the Master of Life, but he heard his voice in a soft breeze. "Go back," said this voice, "to the land from whence you came. Your time has not yet come. The duties for which I made you, and which you are to perform, are not yet finished. Return to your people and accomplish the duties of a good man. You will be the ruler of your tribe for many days. The rules you must observe will be told you by my messenger who keeps the gate. When he surrenders back your body, he will tell you what to do. Listen to him, and you shall afterward rejoin the spirit which you must now leave behind. She is accepted and will be ever here, as young and as happy as she was when I first called her from the land of snows." When this voice ceased, the narrator awoke. It was all the fabric of a dream, and he was still in the bitter land of snows, and hunger, and tears. End of section 179. Recording by Rhonda Fetterman.
Section 180 of Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Priscilla Hewitt. Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 180. The Maiden Who Loved a Fish. There was once among the marsh peas a small tribe who have their hunting grounds on the shores of the great lake near the Cape of Storms, a woman whose name was Awashanks. She was rather silly and very idle. For days together she would sit doing nothing. Then she was so ugly and ill-shaped that not one of the youths of the village would have aught to say to her by way of courtship or marriage. She squinted very much. Her face was long and thin, her nose excessively large and humped, her teeth crooked and projecting, her chin almost as sharp as the bill of a loon, and her ears as large as those of a deer. Altogether, she was a very odd and strangely formed woman, and wherever she went she never failed to excite much laughter and derision among those who thought that ugliness and deformity were fit subjects for ridicule. Though so very ugly, there was one faculty she possessed in a more remarkable degree than any woman of the tribe. It was that of singing. Nothing, unless such could be found in the land of spirits, could equal the sweetness of her voice or the beauty of her songs. Her favorite place of resort was a small hill, a little removed from the river of her people, and there, seated beneath the shady trees, she would while away the hours of summer with her charming songs. So beautiful and melodious were the things she uttered that by the time she had sung a single sentence, the branches above her head would be filled with the birds that came thither to listen. The thickets around her would be crowded with beasts, and the waters rolling beside her would be alive with fishes, all attracted by the sweet sounds. From the minnow to the porpoise, from the wren to the eagle, from the snail to the lobster, from the mouse to the mole, all hastened to the spot to listen to the charming songs of the hideous marsh-pea maiden. Among the fishes which repaired every night to the vicinity of the little hillock, which was the chosen resting-place of the ugly songstress, was the great chief of the trouts, a tribe of fish inhabiting the river near by. The chief was of a far greater size than the people of his nation usually are, being as long as a man and quite as broad. Of all the creatures which came to listen to the singing of Awashanks, none appeared to enjoy it so highly as the chief of the trouts. As his bulk prevented him from approaching so near as he wished, he from time to time, in his eagerness to enjoy the music to the best advantage, ran his nose into the ground, and thus worked his way a considerable distance into the land. Nightly he continued his exertions to approach the source of the delightful sounds he heard, till at length he had ploughed out a wide and handsome channel, and so effected his passage from the river to the hill, a distance extending an arrow's flight. Thither he repaired every night at the commencement of darkness, sure to meet the maiden who had become so necessary to his happiness. Soon he began to speak of the pleasure he enjoyed, and to fill the ears of Awashanks with fond protestations of his love and affection. Instead of singing to him, she now began to listen to his voice. It was something so new and strange to her to hear the tones of love and courtship, a thing so unusual to be told she was beautiful, that it is not wonderful her head was turned by the new incident, and that she began to think the voice of her lover the sweetest she had ever heard. One thing marred their happiness. This was that the trout could not live upon land, nor the maiden in the water. This state of things gave them much sorrow. They had met one evening at the usual place, and were discoursing together, lamenting that two who loved each other so should be doomed always to live apart, when a man appeared close to Awashanks. He asked the lovers why they seemed to be so sad. The chief of the trouts told the stranger the cause of their sorrow. "Be not grieved nor hopeless," said the stranger, when the chief had finished. "The impediments can be removed. I am the spirit who presides over fishes, and though I cannot make a man or woman of a fish, I can make them into fish. Under my power Awashanks shall become a beautiful trout." With that he bade the girl follow him into the river. When they had waded in some little depth, he took up some water in his hand and poured it over her head, muttering some words, of which none but himself knew the meaning. Immediately a change took place in her. Her body took the form of a fish, and in a few moments she was a complete trout. Having accomplished this transformation, the spirit gave her to the chief of the trouts, and the pair glided off into the deep and quiet waters. She did not, however, forget the land of her birth. Every season, on the same night as that upon which her disappearance from her tribe had been wrought, there were to be seen two trouts of enormous size playing in the water off the shore. They continued their visits till the pale-faces came to the country, when, deeming themselves to be in danger from a people who paid no reverence to the spirits of the land, they bade it adieu for ever. End of section 180. Recording by Priscilla Hewitt.
Section 181 of Childhood's Favourites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Childhood's Favourites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 181. The Star Wife. In the days when the buffalo raced and thundered over the earth, and the stars danced and sang in the sky, a brave young hunter lived on the bank of the Battle River. He was fond of the red flowers and the blue sky, and when the rest of the Indians went out to hunt in waistcloths of skin, he put on his fringed leggings all heavy with blue beads, and painted red rings and stripes on his face, till he was as gay as the earth and the sky himself. High Feather was his name, and he always wore a red swan's feather on his head. One day, when High Feather was out with his bow and arrows, he came on a little beaten trail that he had never seen before, and he followed it, but he found that it went round and round, and brought him back to where he had started. It came from nowhere, and it went to nowhere. "What sort of animal has made this?" he said, and he lay down in the middle of the ring to think, looking up into the blue sky. While he lay thinking, he saw a little speck up above him in the sky, and thought it was an eagle, but the speck grew bigger, and sank down and down, till he saw it was a great basket coming down out of the sky. He jumped up and ran back to a little hollow, and lay down to hide in a patch of tall red flowers. Then he peeped out, and saw the basket come down to the earth, and rest on the grass, in the middle of the ring. 12 beautiful maidens were leaning over the edge of the basket. They were not Indian maidens, for their faces were pink and white, and their long hair was bright red-brown, like a fox's fur, and their clothes were sky-blue, and floating light as cobwebs. The maidens jumped out of the basket and began to dance round and round the ring trail, one behind the other, drumming with their fingers on little drums of eagle skin, and singing such beautiful songs as High Feather had never heard. Then High Feather jumped up and ran towards the ring, crying out, "Let me dance and sing with you." The maidens were frightened and ran to the basket and jumped in, and the basket flew up into the sky and grew smaller till at last he could not see it at all. The young man went home to his wigwam, and his mother roasted buffalo meat for his dinner, but he could not eat, and he could not think of anything but the 12 beautiful maidens. His mother begged him to tell her what the matter was, and at last he told her, and said he would never be happy till he brought one of the maidens home to be his wife. "Those must be the Star people," said his mother, who was a great magician. The prairie was full of magic in those days, before the white man came and the buffalo went. "You had better take an Indian girl for your wife. Don't think any more of the Star maidens, or you will have much trouble." "I care little how much trouble I have, so long as I get a Star maiden for my wife," he said, "and I am going to get one, if I have to wait till the world ends." "If you must, you must," said his mother. So next morning she sewed a bit of gopher's fur onto his feather, and he ate a good breakfast of buffalo meat and tramped away over the prairie to the dancing ring. As soon as he came into the ring, he turned into a gopher, but there were no gopher's holes there for him to hide in, so he had to lie in the grass and wait. Presently he saw a speck up in the sky, and the speck grew larger and larger till it became a basket, and the basket came down and down till it rested on the earth in the middle of the ring. The eldest maiden put her head over the edge and looked all around, north and east and south and west. "There is no man here," she said, so they all jumped out to have their dance. But before they came to the beaten ring, the youngest maiden spied the gopher, and called out to her sisters to look at it. "Away, away!" cried the eldest maiden. "No gopher would dare to come on our dancing ground. It is a conjurer in disguise." So she took her younger sister by the arm and pulled her away to the basket, and they all jumped in, and the basket went sailing up into the sky before High Feather could get out of his gopher skin or say a word. The young man went home very miserable, but when his mother heard what had happened, she said, "It is a hard thing you want to do, but if you must, you must. Tonight I will make some fresh magic, and you can try again tomorrow." Next morning High Feather asked for his breakfast, but his mother said, "You must not have any buffalo meat, or it will spoil the magic. You must not eat anything but the wild strawberries you find on the prairie as you go." Then she sewed a little bit of mouse's whisker onto his red feather, and he tramped away across the prairie, picking wild strawberries and eating them as he went, till he came to the dancing ring. As soon as he was inside the ring, he turned into a little mouse and made friends with the family of mice that lived in a hole under the grass, and the mother mouse promised to help him all she could. They had not waited long when the basket came dropping out of the sky. The eldest sister put her head over the edge and looked all around, north and west and south and east, and down on the ground. "There is no man here," she said, "and I do not see any gopher, but you must be very careful." So they all got out of the basket and began to dance round the ring, drumming and singing as they went. But when they came near the mouse's nest, the eldest sister held up her hand, and they stopped dancing and held their breath. Then she tapped on the ground and listened. "It does not sound so hollow as it did," she said. "The mice have a visitor." And she tapped again and called out, "Come and show yourselves, you little traitors, or we will dig you up." But the mother mouse had made another door to her nest, just outside the ring, working very fast with all her toes. And while the maidens were looking for her inside the ring, she came out at the other door with all her children and scampered away across the prairie. The maidens turned round and ran after them, all but the youngest sister, who did not want anyone to be killed, and High Feather came out of the hole and turned himself into what he was, and caught her by the arm. "Come home and marry me," he said, "and dance with the Indian maidens, and I will hunt for you, and mother will cook for you, and you will be much happier than up in the sky." Her sisters came rushing round her, and begged her to go back home to the sky with them. But she looked into the young man's eyes, and said she would go with him wherever he went. So the other maidens went weeping and wailing up into the sky, and High Feather took his star wife home to his tent on the bank of the Battle River. High Feather's mother was glad to see them both, but she whispered in his ear, "You must never let her out of your sight if you want to keep her. You must take her with you everywhere you go." And he did so. He took her with him every time he went hunting, and he made her a bow and arrows, but she would never use them. She would pick wild strawberries and gooseberries and raspberries as they went along, but she would never kill anything, and she would never eat anything that anyone else had killed. She only ate berries and crushed corn. One day, while the young man's wife was embroidering feather stars on a dancing cloth, and his mother was gossiping in a tent at the other end of the village, a little yellow bird flew in and perched on High Feather's shoulder and whispered in his ear, "There is a great flock of wild red swans just over on Loon Lake. If you come quickly and quietly, you can catch them before they fly away. But do not tell your wife, for red swans cannot bear the sight of a woman, and they can tell if one comes within a mile of them." High Feather had never seen or heard of a red swan before. All the red feathers he wore he had had to paint. He looked at his wife, and as she was sewing busily and looking down at her star embroidering, he thought he could slip away and get back before she knew he had gone. But as soon as he was out of sight, the little yellow bird flew in and perched on her shoulder, and sang her such a beautiful song about her sisters in the sky that she forgot everything else and slipped out and ran like the wind and got to the dancing ring just as her sisters came down in their basket. Then they all gathered round her and begged her to go home with them. But she only said, "High Feather is a brave man, and he is very good to me, and I will never leave him." When they saw they could not make her leave her husband, the oldest sister said, "If you must stay, you must, but just come up for an hour to let your father see you, because he has been mourning for you ever since you went away." The star wife did not wish to go, but she wanted to see her father once more, so she got into the basket, and it sailed away up into the sky. Her father was very glad to see her, and she was very glad to see him, and they talked till the blue sky was getting grey. Then she remembered that she ought to have gone home long before. "Now I must go back to my husband," she said. "That you shall never do," said her father. And he shut her up in a white cloud, and said she should stay there till she promised never to go back to the prairie. She begged to be let out, but it was no use. Then she began to weep, and she wept so much that the cloud began to weep too, and it was weeping itself quite away. So her father saw she would go down to the earth in rain if he kept her in the cloud any longer, and he let her out. "What must I do for you," he said, "to make you stay with us here and be happy?" "I will not stay here," she said, "unless my husband comes and lives here too." "I will send for him at once," said her father. So he sent the basket down empty, and it rested in the middle of the dancing ring. Now when High Feather reached Loon Lake, he found it covered with red swans. He shot 2 with 1 arrow, and then all the rest flew away. He picked up the 2 swans and hurried back to his tent, and there lay the dancing cloth with the feather stars on it, half finished, but no wife could he see. He called her, but she did not answer. He rushed out with the 2 red swans still slung round his neck and hanging down his back, and ran to the dancing ring, but nobody was there. "I will wait till she comes back," he said to himself, "if I have to wait till the world ends." So he threw himself down on the grass and lay looking up at the stars till he went to sleep. Early in the morning he heard a rustling on the grass, and when he opened his eyes he saw the great basket close beside him. He jumped up, with the 2 red swans still slung round his neck, and climbed into the basket. There was nobody there, and when he began to climb out again, he found that the basket was halfway up to the sky. It went up, and at last it came into the star country, where his wife was waiting for him. Her father gave them a beautiful blue tent to live in, and Highfeather was happy enough for a while, but he soon grew tired of the cloudberries that the star people ate, and he longed to tramp over the solid green prairie, so he asked his wife's father to let him take her back to the earth. "No," said the Starman, "because then I should never see her again. If you stay with us, you will soon forget the dull old earth." The young man said nothing, but he put on the wings of one of the red swans, and he put the other red swan's wings on his wife, and they leapt over the edge of the star country and flew down through the air to the prairie, and came to the tent where Highfeather's mother was mourning for them. And there was a great feast in the village, because they had come back safe and sound. The star wife finished embroidering her dancing cloth that day, and whenever the Indians danced, she danced with them. She never went back to the Star Maiden's dancing ring, but she still lived on berries and corn, because she would never kill anything, except one thing, and that was the little yellow bird. It flew into her tent one day when Highfeather had his back turned, and began to whisper into the star wife's ear, but it never came to trouble her again. End of section 181, The Star Wife. Recording by Ross Clement.
Section 182 of Childhood's Favourites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Childhood's Favourites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 182. The Story of Caliph Stork. Caliph Sharid of Baghdad was reclining on his divan one pleasant afternoon, smoking his long pipe and sipping coffee from a handsome dish which a slave was holding for him, when his Grand Vizier Mansour entered and told him of a pedlar in the court below, whose wares might interest him. The Caliph, being in an affable state of mind, summoned the pedlar, who, delighted with the opportunity, displayed all the treasures of his pack. There were pearls, rings, silks, and many other rich things. The Caliph selected something for himself, a handsome present for the Vizier, and another for the Vizier's wife. Just as the pedlar was putting the things back into his box, the Caliph noticed a small drawer and asked what it contained. "Only something of no value which I picked up in a street of Mecca," the pedlar replied. He thereupon opened the drawer and showed the Caliph a small box, containing a black powder and a scroll written in characters which neither the Caliph nor his Grand Vizier could make out. The Caliph immediately decided that he wanted this strange scroll, and the pedlar was persuaded to part with it for a trifle. Then the Vizier was asked to find someone to decipher its meaning. Near the mosque lived a man called Selim, who was so learned that he knew every language in the world. When the Vizier brought him to interpret the scroll, the Caliph said to him, "They tell me that you are a scholar and can read all languages. If you can decipher what is written here, I shall know that it is true, and will give you a robe of honour. But if you fail, I shall have you punished with many strokes, because you are falsely named." Selim prostrated himself at the feet of the Caliph, and then took the scroll. He had not looked at it long when he exclaimed, "My lord and master, I hope to die if this is not Latin." "Well, if so, let us hear what it says," the Caliph impatiently answered. Selim at once began. "Let him who finds this box praise Allah. If he snuffs the powder it contains, at the same time pronouncing the word Matabor, he will be transformed into any creature that he desires, and will understand the language of all animals. When he wishes to return to his own form, let him bow to the east 3 times, repeating the word Matabor. But remember, if while he is bird or beast he should laugh, the magic word would be forgotten, and the enchantment would be on him forever." The Caliph was delighted with the knowledge of Selim. He made him a splendid present and told him to keep the secret. When he had dismissed the learned man, he turned to the Grand Vizier and expressed a wish to try the powder. "Come tomorrow morning early," said he, "and we will go together to the country and learn what the animals are talking about." The Vizier came as he was ordered, and they left the palace without attendants. Beyond the town was a large pond where some handsome storks were often seen, and to this place they presently came. A grave and stately stork was hunting for frogs, while another flew about and kept him company. "Most gracious lord," said the Vizier, "what think you of these dignified long legs, and how would you like to know their chatter?" The Caliph replied that the stork had always interested him, and he would very much like a more intimate acquaintance. Taking the box from his girdle, he helped himself to a pinch of snuff, and offered it to the Vizier, who followed his example. Together they cried "Matabor," and instantly their beards disappeared, and feathers covered their bodies. Their necks stretched out long and slender, and their legs shriveled into red and shapeless sticks. The Caliph lifted up his foot to stroke his beard in astonishment, but found a long bill in its place. "By the beard of the Prophet, since I have not one of my own to swear by, but we are a pretty pair of birds, Mansour." "If I may say so, your Highness, you are equally handsome as a stork as when you were a Caliph," replied the Vizier. "I see our two relations are conversing over there. Shall we join them?" When they came near to where the storks were smoothing their feathers and touching bills in the most friendly manner, this was the conversation they overheard. "Will you have some of my frog's legs for breakfast, Dame Yellowlegs?" "No, thank you. I am obliged to practise a dance for my father's guests, and cannot eat." Thereupon Dame Yellowlegs stepped out and began to pose, most gracefully. The Caliph and the Vizier watched her until she stood on one foot and spread her wings. Then they both at the same time burst into such peals of laughter that the two storks flew away. Suddenly, however, the Vizier ceased his mirth and commenced bowing to the east. The Caliph recovered himself and did the same, but neither could think of the magic word. "Mansour, just recall that unholy word, and I will become Caliph once more, and you my Grand Vizier. I have had enough of being a bird for one day." "Most gracious lord, that dancing stork has undone us, for since laughing at her antics, I cannot remember the word that will restore us to human shape." So at last, in despair, the two unhappy birds wandered through the meadows. They appeased their hunger with fruits, for they could not bring themselves to eat frogs and lizards. As they dared not return to Baghdad and tell the people their chagrin, they flew over the city and had the satisfaction of seeing signs of mourning and confusion. In a few days, however, while sitting on the roof of a house, they saw a splendid procession coming up the street, and the people welcoming the new ruler. "Hail! Hail Mirza, rule of Baghdad!" they shouted. The procession came nearer. At the head of it the Caliph saw a man dressed in scarlet and gold riding a handsome horse. He at once recognized the new ruler as the son of his worst enemy. "Behold," said he, "the explanation of our enchantment. This is the son of Kashnur, the magician, who is my great enemy, who seeks revenge. Let us not lose hope, but fly to the sacred grave of the Prophet, and pray to be released from the spell." They at once spread their wings and soared away toward Medina, but not being accustomed to such long flights, they soon became fatigued and descended to a ruin which stood in a valley below. The two enchanted birds decided to remain there for the night, then wandered through the deserted rooms and corridors, which gave of evidence of former splendor. Suddenly the Vizier stopped and remarked that if it were not ridiculous for a stork to be afraid of ghosts, he would feel decidedly nervous. The Caliph listened and heard a low moaning and sobbing, which seemed to come from a room down the passage. He started to rush toward it, but the Vizier held him fast by a wing. He had retained the brave heart that he had possessed when a Caliph, however, and freeing himself from the Vizier's bill, he hurried to the room whence came the pitiful sounds. The moon shone through a barred window and showed him a screech owl sitting on the floor of the ruined chamber, lamenting in a hoarse voice. The Vizier had cautiously stolen up beside the Caliph, and at the sight of the two storks the screech owl uttered a cry of pleasure. To their astonishment it addressed them in Arabic in the following words: "I have abandoned myself to despair, but I believe my deliverance is near, for it was prophesied in my youth that a stork would bring me good fortune." The Caliph, thus appealed to, arched his neck most gracefully, and replied, "Alas, screech owl, I fear we are unable to aid you, as you will understand when you have heard our miserable story." He then related how the magician Kaschnur had exchanged them into storks and made his own son ruler of Baghdad. The screech owl became very much excited and exclaimed, "How strange that misfortune should come to us through the same man! I am Tusa, the daughter of the king of the Indies. The magician Kaschnur came one day to my father to ask my hand in marriage for his son Mirza. My father ordered him thrown down the stairs, and in revenge he managed to have given me a powder which changed me into this hideous shape. He then conveyed me to this lonely castle, and I swore I should remain here until someone asked me to be his wife, and so freed me from the enchantment." At the conclusion of her story, the screech owl wept anew and would not be consoled. Suddenly, however, she wiped her eyes on her wing and said, "I have an idea that may lead to our deliverance. Once every month the magician Kaschnur and his companions meet in a large hall at this castle, where they feast and relate their evil deeds. We will listen outside the door, and perhaps you may hear the forgotten word. Then, when you have resumed human form, one of you can ask to marry me, that I too may be freed from this wretched enchantment, and the prophecy that a stork would bring me happiness would be fulfilled." The Caliph and the Vizier withdrew and consulted over the situation. "It is unfortunate," said the Caliph, "but if we are to meet again, I think you will have to ask the screech owl to marry you." "Not so, your Highness. I already have a wife, and would rather remain a stork forever than take another. Besides, I am an old man, while you are young and unmarried, and much better suited to a beautiful princess." "That is it," said the Caliph. "How do I know that she will not prove to be some old fright?" As the Vizier was firm, the Caliph at last said he would take the chances and do as the screech owl required. That very night it so happened that the magicians met at the ruined castle. The screech owl led the two storks through difficult passages till they came to a hole in the wall, through which they could plainly see all that transpired in the lighted hall. Handsomely carved pillars adorned the room, and a table was spread with many dishes. About the table sat 8 men, among whom was their enemy, the magician. He entertained the company with many stories, and at last came to his latest, that of turning the Caliph and Vizier into storks, in relating which he pronounced the magic word. The storks did not wait to hear more, but ran to the door of the castle. The screech owl followed as fast as she could, and when the Caliph saw her, he exclaimed, "To prove my gratitude, O our deliverer, I beg you to take me for your husband." Then the two storks faced the rising sun and bowed their long necks 3 times. Matabor, they solemnly cried together, and in an instant they were no longer storks, but stood before each other in their natural forms. In their joy they fell on each other's necks and forgot all about the screech owl, until they heard a sweet voice beside them, and turning beheld a beautiful princess. When the Caliph recovered from his astonishment, he said that he was now indeed enchanted, and hoped to remain so always. They then started at once for the gate of Baghdad, and when they arrived the people were overjoyed, for they had believed their ruler dead. The magician was taken to the ruined castle and hanged, and his son was given the choice of the black powder or death. Choosing the powder, he was changed into a stork and was kept in the palace gardens. Caliph Charid and the princess were married, and when their children grew old enough, the Caliph often amused them with imitations of the Grand Vizier when he was a stork, while Mansur sat smiling and pulling his long beard. End of section 182.
Section 183 of Childhood's Favourites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Children's Favourites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 183, Persevere and Prosper. Persevere and Prosper, adapted by A.R. Montalba. He that seeketh shall find, and to him that knocketh shall be opened, says an old Arab proverb. I will try that, said a youth one day. To carry out his intention, he journeyed to Baghdad, where he presented himself before the vizier. Lord, said he, for many years I have lived a quiet and solitary life, the monotony of which wearies me. I have never permitted myself earnestly to will anything, but as my teacher daily repeated to me, he that seeketh shall find, and to him that knocketh shall be opened. So have I now come to the resolution with might and heart to will, and the resolution of my will is nothing less than to have the Caliph's daughter for my wife. The vizier thought the poor man was mad, and told him to call again some other time. Perseveringly he daily returned, and never felt disconcerted at the same often repeated answer. One day the Caliph called on the vizier, as the youth was repeating his statement. Full of astonishment, the Caliph listened to the strange demand, and being in no humour for having the poor youth's head taken off, but on the contrary, being rather inclined for pleasantry, his mightiness condescendingly said, For the great, the wise, or the brave, to request a princess for wife is a moderate demand. But what are your claims? To be the possessor of my daughter, you must distinguish yourself by one of these attributes, or else by some great undertaking. Ages ago, a carbuncle of inestimable value was lost in the Tigris. He who finds it shall have the hand of my daughter. The youth, satisfied with the promise of the Caliph, went to the shores of the Tigris. With a small vessel, he went every morning to the river, scooping out the water and throwing it on the land. After having for hours thus employed himself, he knelt down and prayed. The fishes became at last uneasy at his perseverance, and being fearful that, in the course of time, he might exhaust the waters, they assembled in great council. "What is the purpose of this man?" demanded the monarch of the fishes. "The possession of the carbuncle that lies buried in the bottom of the Tigris," was the reply. "I advise you then," said the aged monarch, "to give it up to him, for if he has the steady will, and is positively resolved to find it, he will work until he has drained the last drop of water from the Tigris, rather than deviate a hair's breadth from his purpose." The fishes, out of fear, threw the carbuncle into the vessel of the youth, and the latter, as a reward, received the daughter of the Caliph for his wife. He who earnestly wills can do much. End of section 183. Persevere and Prosper. Recording by Ross Clement.
Section 184 of Childhood Favorites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ralph Snelson. Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 184. The Most Frugal of Men. A man who was considered the most frugal of all the dwellers in a certain kingdom heard of another man who was the most frugal in the whole world. He said to his son thereupon, "We indeed live upon little, but if we were more frugal still, we might live upon nothing at all. It will be well worth while for us to get instructions in economy from the most frugal of men." The son agreed, and the two decided that the son should go and inquire whether the master in economic science would take pupils. An exchange of presents being a necessary preliminary to closer intercourse, the father told the son to take the smallest of coins, 1 farthing, and to buy a sheet of paper of the cheapest sort. The boy, by bargaining, got 2 sheets of paper for the farthing. The father put away 1 sheet, cut the other sheet in halves, and on 1/2 drew a picture of a pig's head. This he put into a large covered basket, as if it were the thing which it represented, the usual gift sent in token of great respect. The son took the basket, and after a long journey reached the abode of the most frugal man in the world. The master of the house was absent, but his son received the traveller, learned his errand, and accepted the offering. Having taken from the basket the picture of the pig's head, he said courteously to his visitor, "I am sorry that we have nothing in the house that is worthy to take the place of the pig's head in your basket. I will, however, signify our friendly reception of it by putting in 4 oranges for you to take home with you." Thereupon the young man, without having any oranges at hand, made the motions necessary for putting the fruit into the basket. The son of the most frugal man in the kingdom then took the basket and went to his father to tell of thrift surpassing his own. When the most frugal man in the world returned home, his son told him that a visitor had been there, having come from a great distance to take lessons in economy. The father inquired what offering he brought as an introduction, and the son showed the small outline of the pig's head on thin brown paper. The father looked at it, and then asked his son what he had sent as a return present. The son told him he had merely made the motions necessary for transferring 4 oranges, and showed how he had clasped the imaginary fruit and deposited it in the visitor's basket. The father immediately flew into a terrible rage and boxed the boy's ears, exclaiming, "You extravagant wretch! With your fingers thus far apart, you appeared to give him large oranges. Why didn't you measure out small ones?" End of the Most Frugal of Men.
Section 185 of Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Clarica. Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories by various authors. The Moon Cake. A little boy had a cake that a big boy coveted. Designing to get the cake without making the little boy cry so loud as to attract his mother's attention, the big boy remarked that the cake would be prettier if it were more like the moon. The little boy thought that a cake like the moon must be desirable, and on being assured by the big boy that he had made many such, he handed over his cake for manipulation. The big boy took out a mouthful, leaving a crescent with a jagged edge. The little boy was not pleased by the change, and began to whimper, whereupon the big boy pacified him by saying that he would make the cake into a half moon. So he nibbled off the horns of the crescent and gnawed the edge smooth, but when the half moon was made, the little boy perceived that there was hardly any cake left, and he again began to snivel. The big boy again diverted him by telling him that, if he did not like so small a moon, he should have one that was just the size of the real orb. He then took the cake and explained that, just before the new moon is seen, the old moon disappears. Then he swallowed the rest of the cake and ran off, leaving the little boy waiting for the new moon. End of section 185.
Section 186 of Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Alma Molino. Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 186, The Ladle That Fell from the Moon. Once there was an old woman who lived on what she got by wile from her relatives and neighbors. Her husband's brother lived alone with his only son in a house near hers, and when the son brought home a wife, the old woman went to call on the bride. During the call she inquired of the bride whether she had not, since her arrival in the house, heard a scratching at night among the boxes containing her wedding outfit. The bride said she had not. A few days later the old woman came again, and during the visit the bride remarked that, before the matter was mentioned, she had heard no scratching among her boxes, but that since that time she had listened for it, and had heard it every night. The old woman advised her to look carefully after her clothing, saying that there were evidently many mice in the house, and that she would be likely at any time to find her best garments nibbled into shreds. The old woman knew there was no cat in the house, but she inquired whether there was one, and on hearing that there was not, she offered to lend the young woman her own black and white cat, saying that it would soon extirpate all the mice. The bride accepted the loan, and the old woman brought the cat and left it in the bride's apartment. After a few hours the cat disappeared, and the bride, supposing it to have gone home, made no search for it. It did indeed go home, and the old woman secretly disposed of it, but several days later she came to the young woman and said that, when she lent the cat, her house had been free from mice, but that, as soon as the cat was gone, the mice came and multiplied so fast that now everything was overrun by them, and she would be obliged to take the cat home again. The young woman told her that the cat went away the same day that it came, and she had supposed it had gone home. The old woman said it had not, and that nothing could compensate her for the loss of it, for she had reared it herself. That there was never before seen such a cat for catching mice. That a cat, spotted as that one was seldom found, and that it was of the rare breed which gave rise to the common saying, "A coal-black cat with snowy loins is worth its weight in silver coins," and that the weight of her cat was 200 ounces. The young woman was greatly surprised by this estimate of the value of the lost cat, and went to her father-in-law and related all that had occurred. The father-in-law, knowing the character of the old woman, could neither eat nor sleep, so harassed was he by the expectation that she would worry his daughter-in-law till the 200 ounces of silver should be paid. The young woman, being a newcomer, thought but lightly of the matter, till the old woman came again and again to make mention of the cat. When it became apparent that she must defend herself, the young woman asked her father-in-law if he had ever lent anything to the old woman, and when he said he could not remember having lent anything, she begged him to think carefully, and see if he could not recall the loan of a tool, a dish, or a faggot. He finally recollected that he had lent to her an old wooden ladle, but he said it originally cost but a few farthings, and was certainly not worth speaking about. The next time the old woman came to Dun for the amount due for her cat, the young woman asked her to return the borrowed ladle. The old woman said that the ladle was old and valueless, that she had allowed the children to play with it, and that they had dropped it in the dirt, where it had lain until she had picked it up and used it for kindlings. The bride responded, "You expect to enrich yourself and your family by means of your cat. I and my family also want money. Since you cannot give back the ladle, we will both go before the magistrate and present our cases. If your cat is adjudged to be worth more than my ladle, I will pay you the excess, and if my ladle be worth more than your cat, then you must pay me." Being sure that the cat would, by any judge, be considered of greater value than the ladle, the old woman agreed to the proposition, and the two went before the magistrate. The young woman courteously gave precedence to the elder, and allowed her to make the accusation. The old woman set forth her case, and claimed 200 ounces of silver as a compensation for the loss of the cat. When she had concluded her statement, the judge called on the young woman for her defense. She said she could not disprove the statement, but that the claim was offset by a ladle that had been borrowed by the plaintiff. There was a common saying, "In the moon overhead at its full you can see the trunk, branch, and leaf of a cinnamon tree." A branch from this tree had one night been blown down before her father-in-law's door, and he had had a ladle made from the wood. Whatever the ladle was put into never diminished by use. Whether wine, oil, rice, or money, the bulk remained the same if no ladle beside this one were used in dipping it. A foreign innkeeper, hearing of this ladle, came and offered her father-in-law 3,000 ounces of silver for it, but the offer was refused, and this ladle was the one that the plaintiff had borrowed and destroyed. The magistrate, on hearing this defense, understood that the cat had been a pretext for extortion, and decided that the two claims offset each other, so that no payment was due from either one. End of section 186. Recording by Alma Molina.
Section 187 of Childhood's Favourites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Neve. Childhood's Favourites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 187. The Young Head of the Family. There was once a family consisting of a father, his 3 sons, and his 2 daughters-in-law. The 2 daughters-in-law, wives of the 2 elder sons, had but recently been brought into the house, and were both from one village a few miles away. Having no mother-in-law living, they are obliged to appeal to their father-in-law whenever they wished to visit their former homes, and as they were lonesome and homesick, they perpetually bothered the old man by asking leave of absence. Vexed by these constant petitions, he set himself to invent a method of putting an end to them, and at last gave them leave in this wise. You are always begging me to allow you to go and visit your mothers, and thinking that I am very hard-hearted because I do not let you go. Now you may go, but only upon condition that when you come back you will each bring me something I want. The one shall bring me some fire wrapped in paper, and the other some wind in a paper. Unless you promise to bring me these, you are never to ask me to let you go home, and if you go and fail to get these for me, you are never to come back. The old man did not suppose that these conditions would be accepted, but the girls were young and thoughtless, and in their anxiety to get away did not consider the impossibility of obtaining the articles required. So they made ready with speed, and in great glee started off on foot to visit their mothers. After they had walked a long distance, chatting about what they should do and whom they should see in their native village, the high heel of one of them slipped from under her foot, and she fell down. Owing to this mishap, both stopped to adjust the misplaced footgear, and while doing this, the conditions under which alone they could return to their husbands came to mind, and they began to cry. While they sat there crying by the roadside, a young girl came riding along from the fields on a water buffalo. She stopped and asked them what was the matter, and whether she could help them. They told her she could do them no good, but she persisted in offering her sympathy and inviting their confidence, till they told their story. And then she at once said that if they would go home with her, she would show them a way out of their trouble. Their case seemed so hopeless to themselves, and the child was so sure of her own power to help them, that they finally accompanied her to her father's house, where she showed them how to comply with their father-in-law's demand. For the first, a paper lantern only would be needed. When lighted, it would be a fire, and its paper surface would compass the blaze, so that it would truly be some fire wrapped in paper. For the second, a paper fan would suffice. When flapped, wind would issue from it, and the wind wrapped in paper could thus be carried to the old man. The 2 young women thanked the wise child and went on their way rejoicing. After a pleasant visit to their old homes, they took a lantern and a fan and returned to their father-in-law's house. As soon as he saw them, he began to vent his anger at their light regard for his commands. They assured him that they had perfectly obeyed him, and showed him that what they had brought fulfilled the conditions prescribed. Much astonished, he inquired how it was that they had suddenly become so astute, and they told him the story of their journey and of the little girl who had so opportunely come to their relief. He inquired whether the little girl was already betrothed, and finding that she was not, engaged a go-between to see if he could get her for a wife for his youngest son. Having succeeded in securing the girl as a daughter-in-law, he brought her home, and told all the rest of the family that as there was no mother in the house, and as this girl had shown herself to be possessed of extraordinary wisdom, she should be the head of the household. The wedding festivities being over, the sons of the old man made ready to return to their usual occupations on the farm, but according to their father's order, they came to the young bride for instructions. She told them that they were never to go to or from the fields empty-handed. When they went, they must carry fertilizers of some sort for the land, and when they returned, they must bring bundles of sticks for fuel. They obeyed, and soon had the land in fine condition, and so much fuel gathered that none needed to be bought. When there were no more sticks, roots or weeds to bring, she told them to bring stones instead, and they soon accumulated an immense pile of stones, which were heaped in a yard near their house. One day an expert in the discovery of precious stones came along, and saw in this pile a block of jade of great value. In order to get possession of this stone at a small cost, he undertook to buy the whole heap, pretending that he wished to use it in building. The little head of the family asked an exorbitant price for them, and as he could not induce her to take less, he promised to pay her the sum she asked, and to come 2 days later to bring the money and to remove the stones. That night the girl thought about the reason for the buyers being willing to pay so large a sum for the stones, and concluded that the heap must contain a gem. The next morning she sent her father-in-law to invite the buyer to supper, and she instructed the men of her family in regard to his entertainment. The best of wine was to be provided, and the father-in-law was to induce him to talk of precious stones, and to cajole him into telling in what way they were to be distinguished from other stones. The head of the family, listening behind a curtain, heard how the valuable stone in her heap could be discovered. She hastened to find and remove it from the pile, and, when her guest had recovered from the effect of the banquet, he saw that the value had departed from his purchase. He went to negotiate again with the seller, and she conducted the conference with such skill that she obtained the price originally agreed upon for the heap of stones, and a large sum besides for the one in her possession. The family, having become wealthy, built an ancestral hall of fine design and elaborate workmanship, and put the words "No Sorrow" as an inscription over the entrance. Soon after, a mandarin passed that way, and, noticing this remarkable inscription, had his sedan chair set down, that he might inquire who were the people that professed to have no sorrow. He sent for the head of the family, was much surprised on seeing so young a woman thus appear, and remarked, "Yours is a singular family. I have never before seen one without sorrow, nor one with so young a head. I will fine you for your impudence. Go and weave me a piece of cloth as long as this road." "Very well," responded the little woman. "So soon as your excellency shall have found the 2 ends of the road, and inform me as to the number of feet in its length, I will at once begin the weaving." Finding himself at fault, the mandarin added, "And I will also find you as much oil as there is water in the sea." "Certainly," responded the woman. "As soon as you shall have measured the sea, and sent me correct information as to the number of gallons, I will at once begin to press out the oil from my beans." "Indeed," said the mandarin, "since you are so sharp, perhaps you can penetrate my thoughts. If you can, I will fine you no more. I hold this pet quail in my hand. Now tell me whether I mean to squeeze it to death or let it fly in the air." "Well," said the woman, "I am an obscure commoner, and you are a famed magistrate. If you are no more knowing than I, you have no right to find me at all. Now I stand with 1 foot on one side of my threshold, and the other foot on the other side. Tell me whether I mean to go in or come out. If you cannot guess my riddle, you should not require me to guess yours." Being unable to guess her intention, the mandarin took his departure, and the family lived long in opulence and good repute under its chosen head. End of section 187. Recording by Neve. Section 188 of Childhood's Favourites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Neve. Childhood's Favourites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 188. A Dreadful Boar. A poor old woman who lived with her one little granddaughter in a wood was out gathering sticks for fuel, and found a green stalk of sugar cane which she added to her bundle. She presently met an elf in the form of a wild boar that asked her for the cane, but she declined giving it to him, saying that at her age to stoop and rise again was to earn what she picked up, and that she was going to take the cane home and let her little granddaughter suck its sap. The boar, angry at her refusal, said that he would, during the coming night, eat her granddaughter instead of the cane, and went off into the wood. When the old woman reached her cabin, she sat down by the door and wailed, for she knew she had no means of defending herself against the boar. While she sat crying, a vendor of needles came along and asked her what was the matter. She told him, and he said that all he could do for her was to give her a box of needles. This he did, and went on his way. The old woman stuck the needles thickly over the lower half of her door, on its outer side, and then she went on crying. Just then a man came along with a basket of crabs, heard her lamentations, and stopped to inquire what ailed her. She told him, and he said he knew no help for her, but he would do the best he could for her by giving her half his crabs. The old woman put the crabs in her water jar behind her door, and again sat down and cried. A farmer soon came along from the fields, leading his ox, and he also asked the cause of her distress, and heard her sad story. He said he was sorry he could not think of any way of preventing the evil she expected, but that he would leave his ox to stay all night with her, as it might be a sort of company for her in her loneliness. She led the ox into her cabin, tied it to the head of her bedstead, gave it some straw, and then cried again. A courier, returning on horseback from a neighbouring town, next passed her door, and dismounted to inquire what troubled her. Having heard her tale, he said he would leave his horse to stay with her, and make the ox more contented. So she tied the horse to the foot of her bed, and thinking how surely evil was coming upon her with the night, she burst out crying anew. A boy, just then, came along with a snapping turtle that he had caught, and stopped to ask what had happened to her. On learning the cause of her weeping, he said it was of no use to contend against sprites, but that he would give her a snapping turtle as a proof of his sympathy. She took the turtle, tied it in front of her bedstead, and continued to cry. Some men who were carrying millstones then came along, inquired into her trouble, and expressed their compassion by giving her a millstone, which they rolled into her backyard. A little later, a man arrived carrying hoes and a pickaxe, and asked her why she was crying so hard. She told him her grief, and he said he would gladly help her if he could, but he was only a well digger, and could do nothing for her other than to dig her a well. She pointed out a place in the middle of her backyard, and he went to work and quickly dug a well. On his departure, the old woman cried again, until a paper seller came and inquired what was the matter. When she had told him, he gave her a large sheet of white paper as a token of pity, and she laid it smoothly over the mouth of the well. Nightfall came. The old woman shut and barred her door, put her granddaughter snugly on the wall side of the bed, and then lay down beside her to await the foe. At midnight, the boar came and threw himself against the door to break it in. The needles wounded him sorely, so that when he had gained an entrance, he was heated and thirsty, and went to the water jar to drink. When he thrust in his snout, the crabs attacked him, clung to his bristles, and pinched his ears, till he rolled over and over to disencumber himself. Then, in a rage, he approached the front of the bed, but the snapping turtle nipped his tail, and made him retreat under the feet of the horse, who kicked him over to the ox, who tossed him back to the horse, and thus beset, he was glad to escape to the backyard to take a rest, and to consider the situation. Seeing a clean paper spread on the ground, he went to lie upon it, and fell into the well. The old woman heard the fall, rushed out, rolled the millstone down on him, and crushed him. End of section 188, A Dreadful Boar. Recording by Neve.
Section 189 of Children's Favourites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Children's Favourites and Fairy Stories by various authors. King Kojata, 189. King Kojata ruled over a mighty kingdom and was beloved by his subjects, but because he had no heir to his crown, both he and the queen lamented. Once, while travelling through his territories, he came to a well that was filled to the brim with clear cold water, and being very thirsty, he stopped to drink. On the top of the water floated a golden vessel, which the king attempted to seize, but just as his hand touched it, away it floated to the other side of the well. He went around to where the vessel rested and tried again, with the same result. Every time the king touched the basin, it glided from his grasp. At last, losing patience, he gave up trying to seize the vessel, and bending over the well, he began to drink. His long beard had fallen into the water, and when he had slaked his thirst and attempted to rise, he found himself held fast by it. After vainly pulling and jerking for some time, he looked down into the water and saw a hideous face grinning at him. Its eyes were green and shining, its teeth showed from ear to ear, and it held him by the beard with two bony claws. In horror the king tried to extricate himself, but a terrible voice came from the depths of the well. "You cannot get away, King Kojata, so do not make me pull your beard too hard. There is something at the palace of which you do not know. Promise to give it to me, and I will release you." The king did not know of anything that could have arrived at the palace during his absence worth the discomfort he was experiencing, so he very readily gave his promise and was freed. When he had shaken the water from his beard, he looked in the well for the ugly monster which had held him captive, but he was nowhere to be seen. Summoning his attendants, he at once set out for home, where he arrived in a few days. The people along the way hailed him with delight, and when he reached the palace, the queen led him to the royal chamber and showed him a beautiful son that had been born during his absence. His joy was so great that he forgot all else, but after a time he recalled with horror his compact with the monster of the well, and the meaning was all plain to him. The thought of what he had promised haunted him day and night, and the fear that something would happen to his little son tortured him. But as days and months passed, and the little prince grew more beautiful all the time, the king at last forgot his fears and became happy once more. Years went by without anything happening to disturb his peace of mind, and the prince grew to be a beautiful youth, who was the joy and pride of the king and queen. One day he went with the hunters to the forest, and while pursuing a wild boar, became separated from them. He got farther and farther away from his companions, and at last found himself alone in a dark part of the wood, where he never before had been. Not knowing in which direction his path lay, he called again and again to the hunters. At last a hoarse voice answered him, and from the hollow trunk of a lime tree appeared a hideous man with green eyes and terrible teeth. "I've waited for you a long time, Prince Milan," said he. "Who on earth may you be?" asked the prince. "Your father will tell you who I am. Just give my greetings to his majesty and tell him that I am ready to claim the debt he owes me." The green-eyed man then disappeared into the hollow tree from which he came, and when the prince reached home he related his experience to his father. The king turned white and cried, "At last it has come." Then he explained to the prince what had occurred at the well, and added, "Now my happiness is at an end, for you, my son, will be taken from me." The prince told the king not to despair, for though he might go away, he was certain to return to him. His father provided him with a handsome horse with golden stirrups, and the queen gave him a cross to wear about his neck. When he had said farewell to his unhappy parents, he mounted his horse and rode for 2 days without stopping. On the third day he came to a lake on whose smooth surface 30 ducks were swimming, while spread about upon the grass were 30 white garments. The prince dismounted, and taking up one of the garments, seated himself behind a bush and waited to see what would happen. The ducks dived under the water and disported themselves for a time, then came ashore, and putting on the little white garments, they became beautiful maidens and disappeared. But there was one little duck that remained on the lake and swam about in the most distracted manner, uttering piteous cries. The prince came from behind the bush, and the little duck begged him to give back her garment. He had no sooner done so than before him stood the loveliest maiden he had ever seen. "Thank you, Prince Milan, for restoring my garment," said she. "My name is Hyacinthia, and I am one of the 30 daughters of a king of the underworld, to whose castle I will lead you, for he has waited long for you. Approach him on your knees, and do not fear him, for I will be there to help you, whatever happens." She tapped her little foot on the ground, which opened, and they were immediately transported to the palace of her father in the underworld, which was carved from a single carbuncle. When his eyes became accustomed to the radiant light, the prince saw the magician of the lime tree sitting on a dazzling throne. His green eyes looked out from under a golden crown, and his hideous claws clutched the air with rage when he saw the prince. Remembering what the maiden had told him, Prince Milan walked boldly up to the throne and knelt at the feet of the magician, who cursed in a voice that shook the underworld. As the youth was not at all frightened, the magician at last stopped swearing. Laughing at his courage, he welcomed him to his palace and showed him to a beautiful chamber which he was to occupy. On the following day he sent for him and said, "You are very brave, Prince Milan, but you must pay the penalty for keeping me waiting so long for you. Tonight build me a palace of gold and marble, with windows of crystal, and about it the most beautiful gardens in the world, or tomorrow I shall cut off your head." The prince went back to his chamber and sadly awaited his doom. That evening a small bee flew in through his window, and as soon as it entered the room it became Hyacinthia. "Why are you sad, Prince Milan?" she asked. He told her of her father's impossible command and added, "Naturally I am not happy at the thought of losing my head." "Do not be distressed about that," said she, "but trust to me." In the morning he looked out of the window and saw a wonderful marble palace with a roof of gold. When the magician beheld it, he exclaimed, "You have accomplished a great wonder, but I cannot let you off so easily. Tomorrow I will place my 30 daughters in a row, and if you cannot tell me which one is the youngest, you will lose your head." The prince, however, was not cast down at this, for he thought he would have no trouble in recognizing Hyacinthia. That evening the little bee entered the room and told him that this task was quite as difficult as the first, because the sisters were all exactly alike. "But you will know me," said she, "by a little fly which you will discover on my cheek." The next day the magician summoned him to his presence and showed him the 30 daughters standing in a row. The prince passed before them twice without daring to choose, but he saw the little fly on the pink cheek of one of the maidens. "This is Hyacinthia," exclaimed he. The magician was greatly astonished, but not yet satisfied, he required of the prince still another task. "If before this candle burns to the bottom," said he, "you make me a pair of boots reaching to my knees, I will let you go, but if you fail, you will lose your head." "Then we must fly, for I love you dearly," said Hyacinthia. When the prince had told her of this new task, she breathed on the window pane, and straightway it was covered with frost. Then, leading Prince Milan from the chamber, she locked the door, and they fled through the passage by which they had entered the underworld. Beside the smooth lake his horse was still grazing, and mounting it they were borne swiftly away. When the magician sent for the prince to come to him, the frozen breath replied to the messengers, and so delayed the discovery of his escape. At last the magician lost patience and ordered the door burst open. The frozen breath mocked at him, and he hastened in pursuit of the fugitives. "I hear the sound of horses' feet behind us," said Hyacinthia. The prince dismounted and, putting his ear to the ground, answered, "Yes, they are near." Hyacinthia thereupon changed herself into a river, and the prince became a bridge, and his horse a blackbird. Their pursuers, no longer finding their footprints, were obliged to return to the magician, who cursed them and again sent them forth. "I hear the sound of horses' feet behind us," again said Hyacinthia. The prince put his ear to the earth and said, "Yes, they are nearly upon us." Thereupon Hyacinthia changed herself, the prince and the horse, all into a dense forest in which many paths crossed, so that the followers were bewildered, and they again returned to the magician. "I hear horses' feet behind us," said Hyacinthia a third time, and this time it was the magician himself. Hyacinthia took the little cross from the neck of the prince, and changed herself into a church, the prince into a monk, and the horse into the belfry, so that when the magician came up, he lost all trace of them, and was obliged to return to the underworld in great chagrin. When he had departed, the prince and Hyacinthia mounted the horse and rode till they came to a beautiful town. "We must not enter," said she, "for we may not come out again." But the prince would not take her advice, and insisted upon passing through the gates. "Then," sadly replied the maiden, "when the king and queen of the town come out to meet you, do not kiss the little child which they will lead by the hand, or you will forget me and never come back. As for me, I will become a milestone and wait for you here." It was all as Hyacinthia had said. The king and queen came out to greet him, and when the lovely little child ran up to him for a caress, he kissed its pretty face and forgot Hyacinthia. The first and second day went by, and when the third day came, Hyacinthia wept, and became a little blue flower growing by the roadside. An old man came along, and digging up the flower, carried it home with him and planted it in his garden. He watered and tended it carefully, and one day the little flower became a beautiful maiden. "Why did you not leave me to die by the roadside?" she asked, and told the man her story. "Tomorrow is Prince Milan's wedding day," said the old man. Hyacinthia at once dried her tears and presented herself at the palace dressed like a peasant. She went to the cook and asked to be allowed to make the wedding cake. The cook was so struck with her beauty that he could not refuse the request. When the guests were all seated about the table, Prince Milan was called upon to cut the cake. As soon as he had done so, out flew 2 beautiful doves, which circled about his head. "Dear mate," cried one of the doves, "do not leave me as Prince Milan left Hyacinthia." The prince, who suddenly recollected all he had forgotten, ran from the room, and at the door found Hyacinthia, and his horse awaiting him. They mounted and rode swiftly away to the kingdom of King Kojata, where the king and queen received them with tears of joy, and they all lived in happiness to the end of their days. End of section 189.
Section 190 of Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 190. The Story of King Frost. A shrewish peasant woman had a daughter on whom she lavished everything she could get, and a stepdaughter whom she neglected and ill-treated. In the mother's eyes, the daughter had no faults, while the stepdaughter was always blamed, and, try as she might, the poor girl never could please. So unhappy was she made that her eyes were often red from weeping. The sight of her tear-stained face only angered the stepmother the more, and caused her to say to the girl's father, "Send her away, old man. My eyes are tired of the sight of her, and my ears of the sound of her voice. Send her out of the house." The father begged to have his daughter remain, but the shrew was determined to be rid of her, and gave him no peace. At last, when he could gainsay her no longer, he placed his daughter in a sledge and drove her to the open fields. Here he left her with nothing to shield her from the bitter cold. Kissing her goodbye, he drove away, not daring to look back at her. Left alone by her father, the girl wandered across the bleak fields to the edge of the forest, where she sat down under a fir tree and wept. A crackling sound caused her to look up, and she saw King Frost springing from one tree to another. When he reached the fir tree, he jumped down beside her with a bound. Snapping his fingers in her lovely face, he asked, "Do you know who I am?" "I will tell you. I am King Frost." "Hail to you, great king," smiled the maiden. "Have you come for me?" "Are you warm, fair maiden?" he asked in answer. "Yes, quite warm, King Frost," the maiden replied, although she was shivering. King Frost bent over her and snapped his fingers about her until the air seemed full of needles. Again he asked, "Are you still warm, dear maiden?" Her lips could scarcely move to utter the words, "Quite warm, King Frost." He snapped his teeth and cracked his fingers till all the air was filled with stinging things. His eyes glistened, and for the last time he asked, "Are you warm now, beautiful maiden? Are you still warm, my dear?" She was now scarcely able to speak, but managed to gasp, "Still warm, King Frost." The gentle girl's patience and uncomplaining endurance caused King Frost to take pity on her suffering. He arrayed her in a robe embroidered in silver and gold, and decked her with sparkling diamonds. She glittered and shone and was dazzling to behold. Then, placing her in his sleigh, he wrapped her in furs, and 6 white horses bore them swiftly away. The stepmother at home was baking pancakes for the girl's funeral feast. "Go in the field," she said to her husband, "and bring your daughter's body home so we can bury her." The old man rose to obey, when the little dog barked. "Your daughter shall not die. Hers cold and stiff shall lie." The woman kicked the dog, then tried to coax it with a pancake, telling it to say, "Her daughter shall have gold. His be frozen stiff and cold." When the little dog had swallowed the pancake, he barked, "His daughter shall be wed. Hers shall be frozen dead." The woman beat the dog, then coaxed it with more pancakes, but the blows could not terrify it, nor food persuade. It barked always the same. Suddenly the door opened, and a huge chest was thrust into the room, followed by the radiant stepdaughter in a dress that dazzled them with its beauty. As soon as the stepmother recovered from her astonishment, she ordered her husband to yoke the horses to the sledge and take her own daughter to the field. "Take care you leave her in the same place," the old woman cautioned. The father left the girl as he was bidden and returned to his home. She was not long alone when King Frost came by. "Are you warm, maiden?" he asked. "You must be a fool not to see that my hands and feet are nearly frozen," she angrily replied. The king danced in front of her and cracked his fingers. "Are you warm, maiden?" he asked her over and over. She cried with rage and called him rude names until he froze the words on her lips and she was dead. The mother waited for her daughter's return until she became impatient. Then she told her husband to take the sledge and go for her. "But don't lose the chest," she added. The dog under the table barked, "Your daughter, frozen cold, will never need a chest of gold." The old woman was scolding the dog for telling lies when the door opened. Rushing out to welcome her daughter and her treasures, she clasped the frozen body in her arms, and the chill of it killed her. End of section 190. Recording by John Chase, Edmonton.
Section 191 of Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Clarica. Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 191. Tell Us a Tale by Edward Shirley. Tell us a tale, dear mother, a fairy tale, do, please. Take baby brother on your lap, we'll sit beside your knees. We will not speak, we will not stir until the tale is told, and we'll be oh so comfy, and just as good as gold. What shall it be, my children? Aladdin and his lamp? Or shall I tell the story of Puss in Boots, the scamp? Or would you like to hear the tale of Bluebeard, fierce and grim? Or Jack who climbed the beanstalk? I think you're fond of him. Or shall I tell you, children, about Red Riding Hood? Or what befell those little babes who wandered in the wood? Or how sweet Cinderella went so gaily to the ball? Yes, yes, we cried, and clapped our hands. We want to hear them all. End of section 191.
Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 192. Little Red Hen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, contact LibriVox.org. Reading by Father Ziley. Little Red Hen. Little Red Hen found a grain of wheat. "Who will plant this?" she asked. "Not I," said the cat. "Not I," said the goose. "Not I," said the rat. "Then I will," said Little Red Hen. So she buried the wheat in the ground. After a while it grew up yellow and ripe. "The wheat is ripe now," said Little Red Hen. "Who will cut and thresh it?" "Not I," said the cat. "Not I," said the goose. "Not I," said the rat. "Then I will," said Little Red Hen. So she cut it with her bill and threshed it with her wings. Then she asked, "Who will take this wheat to the mill?" "Not I," said the cat. "Not I," said the goose. "Not I," said the rat. "Then I will," said Little Red Hen. So she took the wheat to the mill, where it was ground. Then she carried the flour home. "Who will make me some bread with this flour?" she asked. "Not I," said the cat. "Not I," said the goose. "Not I," said the rat. "Then I will," said Little Red Hen. So she made and baked the bread. Then she said, "Now we shall see who will eat this bread." "We will," said cat, goose, and rat. "I am quite sure you would," said Little Red Hen, "if you could get it." Then she called her chicks, and they ate up all the bread. There was none left at all for the cat, or the goose, or the rat. End of section 192.
Section 193 of Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 193. In Search of a Baby by F. Tapsell. "Please, I'm lost." These words and a thump thump on the door were what Mrs. Stone heard as she sat at supper in a tiny house in the wood. She went to open the door, and there she saw a dear little girl about 3 years old. "Please, I'm lost." Again came the words, and 2 fat little fists went up to a pair of big blue eyes. "Come in, little girl, and tell me all about it," said the woman. "Maybe I can help you to find your way." The child let herself be led into the room. Then all at once the 2 tiny fists came down from the 2 blue eyes, and she gave a quick look at the table. "Are you having supper?" she said. "May I have supper too? I'm ever so hungry." "Yes, dear, of course you shall have some," was the reply. "See, you shall sit on this chair by my side. Now, What will you have?" "I think I would like some bread and butter with sugar on it, brown sugar, you know." And soon the little girl was as happy as could be. "What is your name, dear?" asked Mrs. Stone, when supper was over and the little girl had begun to think once more about how she was to find her way home. "Meg," was the reply. "But your other name, for you must have two names." "No, my name is just Meg, of course. I don't have any other name," she said, a look of wonder in the big blue eyes. "Do you know where you live?" "Yes, I lives in the nursery. Didn't you know that?" She was so sure that it did not seem any good to say any more about it. So Mrs. Stone only asked, "Where were you going when you came to my house?" "To find a baby," was the reply. "Rob said that if I went to a house in the wood, they would give me one. Have you got a baby to give me?" "No, dear, I am afraid I have not." "But why do you want a baby? I'm sure you have lots of dolls." "Yes, of course I have. But then you see, dolls are not alive. I want a real baby to play with." "Enid won't play with me much now, for she says I am too small, and Rob is at school all the time." "Why, who is that?" said a voice, and a man came in with a bag of tools. Then the two little fists again went up to the blue eyes, for the little maid was shy of this great big man.
"Well, wife, so you have a friend, I see," he said. "Who is the little lass?"
"I don't know," said his wife. "It seems she was lost and came here to ask her way. She says she came to find a baby."
"Come here, little one, and don't be afraid," said the man. "There never was a child yet who would not come to me."
And as he spoke, he drew her onto his knee.
"Now then, tell me all about it."
After one glance at the man's kind face, Meg nestled up to him and began. "Nurse was so busy she could not be in the room with me. So I put on my hat and came to look for a baby, but I got lost on the way. At last I came to the wood and saw this house. She could not give me a baby as Rob said she would, but she gave me some tea and bread and butter with sugar on it. We only have that on Sunday at home. Is this Sunday?"
"No, little miss," said the man, "but I expect you had it just for a treat, as you had got lost."
But just then steps were heard on the path, and there was a sharp knock on the door. The latch was lifted, and a voice said,
"Have you seen a little girl in a white frock pass this way?"
"Why, that must be Nurse," cried Meg. In spite of being cross at Meg's having run away, Nurse had to laugh. Then she bent down and said,
"But what made you run away like this, Miss Meg?"
"Rob told me that if I came to the house in the wood, I should find a real live baby. But he was wrong, for she," with a smile at Mrs. Stone, "is very nice, but she has not got a baby to give me."
"Of course not, child. But do you know, I have some news for you."
"What is it? Do tell me," cried the little girl.
"While you were away in the wood to look for a baby, we have found a baby at home. You have a new baby brother. Come home with me now, and you shall see him."
"A new little brother?" said Meg, her eyes wide open with wonder. "He must have known I'd gone out to look for one. So now I have got two new friends, and a baby too. Come along quick." "Goodbye," she said to her new friends. "Thank you ever so much for being so kind, and for the supper. I am coming to have supper with you again soon, and then I will bring the new baby with me. You will give me and baby bread and butter with sugar on it, won't you?" And Meg trotted off, as happy as a little queen. End of section 193, In Search of a Baby. Recording by Ross Clement. Section 194 of Childhood's Favourites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Childhood's Favourites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 194, Jock and I and the Others. First of all, I must tell you who I am. My name is Penelope, but Jock always calls me Pen. I am 8 years old. Jock is 6:30.
We live with Mother and Father and Rover and Tibby in a house not very far from a large city. Mother is the nicest person I know in all the world. Father is a very big man. He always has lots of money in his pocket. He goes to business in a train every day. We have a real farm quite near to our house, where they keep cows, chickens, pigs, horses and geese. Jock and I often go to see them all. One day in summer, we went to see the farmer. I had my blue dress on, so that the cows would not be angry when they saw me. We met the farmer near the stable.
"Come," he said, "I have something to show you today."
"What is it?" we both said at the same time.
"Come and see,"
was all that he would say. Then he took us into the stable where he keeps Nobby, the big brown horse, who likes sugar. Now, Nobby was not there, but in the straw were 7 little puppy dogs, oh, so sweet and cuddly. Jock danced round and round the farmer. "May we have one?" he said.
"Ask Mother,"
said the farmer, and off we ran at once. Mother was at the garden gate. We ran up to her. Jock was first, but it was nearly a dead heat. Mother opened the gate and said, "Well, what have you seen today?" "Oh, Mother," said Jock, out of breath. "Oh, Mother dear," I said, out of breath also. "Farmer has such lovely puppies," we both said at once. "May we have one to keep?" By this time we both had our arms around Mother's waist, and she was laughing. "Yes, we can," I said, for I knew. "If Father says yes," said Mother, "you must ask him when he comes home." So we went to the station to meet him. Jock took his bag, and I took his paper parcel to carry it home for him. On the way home, I asked him if he liked dogs, and he said, "Of course." Then Jock said, "Little dogs?" "Oh, yes." "Puppy dogs?" "One at a time is all right." "One puppy dog with brown spots on white?" Jock went on. "Where is it?" asked Father, and his eyes were laughing. You could not see his mouth for his beard. Then we told him, and he said, "Yes, just at the garden gate." So that was how we got Rover. Rover was very soft and downy when he first came to us, but he soon grew to be a big dog. Jock and I taught him many tricks, and he can beg very nicely if we let him get on the couch in the dining room. We put sugar on his nose, and he waits until we count 1, 2, 3. Then he throws the sugar into the air and catches it. End of section 194, Jock and I and the Others. Recording by Ross Clement.
Section 195 of Childhood's Favourites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Porrick. Childhood's Favourites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 195. Dolly Dimple by F. Tapsell. Oh dear, I'm so lonely, and it is so dark. I do want my dear Dolly Dimple. I think I will go and fetch her. And little 4-year-old Babs got out of bed, felt her way to the door. The door was just a wee crack open. As she peeped in, Babs saw that there was a light in the room, and the sight which met her eyes almost made her cry out. On the floor stood Dolly Dimple in her very best frock, and Mr. Jollyman was asking her to dance with him. Teddy Bear was at work on the big drum, and the clown was turning the organ to make music for the dolls to dance to. The tin soldiers on the backs of cows, pigs, and sheep from the Noah's Ark were having a sham fight. The dolls from the doll's house were going for a ride in the big horse and cart. It's too bad of them to go and have a good time like this when I'm in bed, thought Babs. and I am going to take Dolly Dimple away with me all the same." But when she tried to pick up the doll and carry her off, Mr. Jollyman flew at her in a fury. He began to kick her bare legs, till Babs thought she would have no shins left at all. But she would not run away. "I want Dolly Dimple," she said. "She's my doll, and you've no right to try and keep her away from me." "She's yours in the day, but not at night," was the reply. "How do you think we toys could live if we'd no life but the one we endure at your hands? It is in the night that we live and have our good times, for we know you're safe in bed then." "I don't care what you say, I will have her," cried Babs, very angry now. She tried once more to get hold of Dolly Dimple, but before she could do so, Mr. Jollyman turned to the soldiers and said the one word, "Charge!" There was a great noise and a rush, and right down upon the little girl came camels, horses, lions, tigers, sheep, and pigs. But just as she thought her last hour was come, she heard the word, "Halt!" and then the sound of Dolly Dimple saying, "No, don't kill her. She's very good to me, most of the time." The rest of the dolls had begun to dance once more, but Dolly Dimple came up to the little girl and took hold of her arm. "I am queen here in the night," she said. "I will not hurt you, as you have been good to me, and I know you love me. If you like, I will come and stay with you till you go to sleep. Pick me up." So Babs picked up the doll and took it back to bed with her, and hugged it in her arms. End of section 195.
Section 196 of Childhood's Favourites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Childhood's Favourites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 196. The Tale of Peter Rabbit by Beatrix Potter. Once upon a time there were 4 little rabbits, and their names were Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail, and Peter. They lived with their mother in a sandbank, underneath the root of a very big fir tree. "Now, my dears," said old Mrs. Rabbit one morning, "you may go into the fields or down the lane, but don't go into Mr. McGregor's garden. Your father had an accident there. He was put in a pie by Mrs. McGregor. Now run along and don't get into mischief. I am going out." Then old Mrs. Rabbit took a basket and her umbrella and went through the wood to the baker's. She bought a loaf of brown bread and 5 currant buns. Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail, who were good little bunnies, went down the lane to gather blackberries. But Peter, who was very naughty, ran straight away to Mr. McGregor's garden and squeezed under the gate. First he ate some lettuces and some French beans, and then he ate some radishes, and then, feeling rather sick, he went to look for some parsley. But round the end of a cucumber frame, whom should he meet but Mr. McGregor? Mr. McGregor was on his hands and knees planting out young cabbages, but he jumped up and ran after Peter, waving a rake and calling out, "Stop, thief!" Peter was most dreadfully frightened. He rushed all over the garden, for he had forgotten the way back to the gate. He lost one of his shoes among the cabbages, and the other shoe amongst the potatoes. After losing them, he ran on 4 legs and went faster, so that I think he might have got away altogether if he had not unfortunately run into a gooseberry net, and got caught by the large buttons on his jacket. It was a blue jacket with brass buttons, quite new. Peter gave himself up for lost, and shed big tears, but his sobs were overheard by some friendly sparrows, who flew to him in great excitement, and implored him to exert himself. Mr. McGregor came up with a sieve, which he intended to pop upon the top of Peter, but Peter wriggled out just in time, leaving his jacket behind him, and rushed into the tool shed and jumped into a can. It would have been a beautiful thing to hide in if it had not had so much water in it. Mr. McGregor was quite sure that Peter was somewhere in the tool shed, perhaps hidden under a flower pot. He began to turn them over carefully, looking under each. Presently Peter sneezed. Kerchoo! Mr. McGregor was after him in no time, and tried to put his foot upon Peter, who jumped out of a window, upsetting 3 plants. The window was too small for Mr. McGregor, and he was tired of running after Peter. He went back to his work. Peter sat down to rest. He was out of breath and trembling with fright, and he had not the least idea which way to go. Also, he was very damp with sitting in that can. After a time he began to wander about, going lippity-lippity, not very fast, and looking all around. He found a door in a wall, but it was locked, and there was no room for a fat little rabbit to squeeze underneath. An old mouse was running in and out of the stone doorstep, carrying peas and beans to her family in the wood. Peter asked her the way to the gate, but she had such a large pea in her mouth that she could not answer. She only shook her head at him. Peter began to cry. Then he tried to find his way straight across the garden, but he became more and more puzzled. Presently he came to a pond where Mr. McGregor filled his water cans. A white cat was staring at some goldfish. She sat very, very still, but now and then the tip of her tail twitched as if it were alive. Peter thought it best to go away without speaking to her. He had heard about cats from his cousin, little Benjamin Bunny. He went back toward the tool shed, but suddenly, quite close to him, he heard the noise of a hoe. Screech, scratch, scratch, scratch. Peter scuttered underneath the bushes, but presently, as nothing happened, he came out and climbed upon a wheelbarrow and peeped over. The first thing he saw was Mr. McGregor hoeing onions. His back was turned toward Peter, and beyond him was the gate. Peter got down very quietly off the wheelbarrow, and started running as fast as he could go along a straight walk behind some black currant bushes. Mr. McGregor caught sight of him at the corner, but Peter did not care. He slipped underneath the gate, and was safe at last in the wood outside the garden. Mr. McGregor hung up the little jacket and the shoes for a scarecrow to frighten the blackbirds. Peter never stopped running or looked behind him till he got home to the big fir tree. He was so tired that he flopped down upon the nice soft sand on the floor of the rabbit hole and shut his eyes. His mother was busy cooking. She wondered what he had done with his clothes. It was the second little jacket and pair of shoes that Peter had lost in a fortnight. I am sorry to say that Peter was not very well during the evening. His mother put him to bed, and made some chamomile tea, and she gave a dose of it to Peter. 1 tablespoonful to be taken at bedtime. But Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail had bread and milk and blackberries for supper. End of section 196. Section 197 of Childhood's Favourites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Childhood's Favourites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 197. The Miller, His Son, and Their Ass. Once upon a time there was a miller who lived in a little house beside his mill. All day long he worked hard, but at night he went home to his wife and his little boy. One day this miller made up his mind that he would take his ass to the fair and sell it. So he and his boy said farewell to the dame and started off. They had not gone far when they met a number of girls coming from the town. "Look," said one of them, "did you ever see such stupid fellows? They are walking when one of them might be riding." When the miller heard this, he bade the boy get up on the ass, while he tramped along merrily by its side. Soon they came to a number of old men standing by the side of the road talking together. "Look at that," said one of them. "Look at that young rascal riding, while his poor father has to walk. Get down, you idle fellow, and let your father ride." Upon this the son got down from the ass, and the miller took his place. They had not gone very far when they met 2 women coming home from market. "You lazy old man," they cried at once, "how dare you ride when your poor little boy is walking and can hardly keep pace with you?" Then the miller, who was a good-natured man, took his son up behind him, and in this way they went to the town. "My good fellow," said a townsman whom they met, "is that ass your own?" "Yes," replied the miller. "I should not have thought so, by the way you load him," said the man. "Why, you 2 are better able to carry the beast than he is to carry you." "Well," said the miller, "we can but try." So he and his son got down, and tied the legs of the ass together. Then they slung him on a pole, and carried him on their shoulders. It was such a funny sight that the people laughed and jeered at them. The poor ass was very uncomfortable, and tried hard to get off the pole. At last, as they were passing over a bridge, he pulled his legs out of the rope and tumbled to the ground. He was so frightened that he jumped off the bridge into the river and was drowned. Do you know what this story teaches you? If you try to please everybody, you will please nobody. End of section 197. Section 198 of Childhood's Favourites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Childhood's Favourites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 198. The Visit to Santa Claus Land. Jack and Margaret were growing more excited each day because Christmas was so near. They talked of nothing but Santa Claus. "Don't you wish you could see him?" they said over and over. One night, just before Christmas, Mother tucked them in bed and left them to go to sleep. But Jack wiggled, Margaret wriggled. At last they both sat up in bed. "Jack," Margaret whispered, "are you asleep?" "No," said Jack, "I can't go to sleep." "Margaret, don't you wish you could see Santa Claus?" "What's that?" They both listened, and they heard a little tap tap on the window. They looked, and there, right in the window, they saw a funny little brownie. "What's that I heard you say? You want to see Santa Claus? Well, I am one of his brownies. I am on my way back to Santa Claus Land. I'll take you with me if you want to go." Jack and Margaret scrambled from their beds. "Come on, show us the way," they cried in great excitement. "No, indeed," said the brownie. "No one must know the way to Santa Claus Land. Kindly wait a moment." Then the brownie took something soft and thick and dark, and tied it around Jack's eyes. Next he took something soft and thick and dark, and tied it around Margaret's eyes. "How many fingers before you?" he asked. Both of them shook their heads. They could not see a wink. "Very well, now we're off," said the brownie. He took Jack's hand on one side, and Margaret's on the other. It seemed as if they flew through the window. They went on swiftly for a little while. Then the brownie whirled them round and round until they were dizzy, and off they went again. The children could not tell whether they were going north, south, east, or west. After a time they stopped. "Here we are," said the brownie. He uncovered their eyes, and the children saw that they were standing before a big, thick gate. The brownie knocked, and the gate was swung open. They went through it, right into Santa Claus's garden. It was a very queer garden. There were rows and rows of Christmas trees, all glittering with balls and cobwebby tinsel, and instead of flower beds there were beds of every kind of toy in the world. Margaret at once ran over to a bed of dolls. "Let's see if any of them are ripe," said the brownie. "Ripe?" said Margaret in great surprise. "Why, of course," said the brownie. "Now, if this one is ripe, it will shut its eyes." The brownie picked a little doll from the bed and laid it in Margaret's arms. Its eyes went half shut, and then stuck. "No, it's not ripe yet," said the brownie. "Try this one." He picked another one, and this one shut its eyes just as if it had gone to sleep. "We'll take that one," he said, and he dropped it into a big sack he was carrying. "Now this one cries if it's ripe," he said as he picked a lovely infant doll. The brownie gave it a squeeze, and the doll made a funny squeaking noise. "Not quite ripe," he said, and he put it back into the bed. He tried several others, and he picked a good many. Some of them cried, some said Mama and Papa, and some danced when they were wound up. "Oh, do come over here, Margaret," Jack called. Margaret ran over to another bed, and there were drums, big drums, little drums, and middle-sized drums, yellow drums, blue drums, green drums, red drums. "Can we gather some of these?" said Jack to the Brownie. "Why, of course. Let's see if this one is ripe." The Brownie took up a little red drum, and gave it a thump with a drumstick, but it made such a queer sound that Jack and Margaret both laughed out loud. The little red drum was put back into the bed, and the Brownie tried another big one. It went boom, 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 and Jack and Margaret marched all along the bed, keeping step to it. When they had finished picking drums, they went over to a bed filled with horns. That was the most fun of all. Some of them made very queer noises, and on some the Brownie played jolly little tunes. The next bed they came to was filled with toys which could be wound up. There were trains, automobiles, dancing dolls, climbing monkeys, hopping birds, funny wobbling ducks, and every kind of toy you could think of. The children stayed at this bed for a long time. At last Margaret said, "But where is Santa Claus? We want to see him." "Oh, to be sure," said the Brownie. "Come along," and he led them down a long, winding walk to the edge of the garden. Then he pointed to a hill in the distance. "Do you see that large white house? There is where he lives." The children stared at it. It was so white that it seemed to shine in the distance. "Walk right across here," said the Brownie, "then up the hill to Santa Claus's house." "Oh, must we walk across there?" said Margaret. She stared down at the deep dark chasm between the garden and the hill. Across it was stretched a narrow plank. "Walk carefully," said the Brownie, "and mind you don't look down, for if you do, I'm afraid you won't see Santa Claus tonight." "We'll be very careful," said Jack. "Come along, Margaret," and he took his little sister's hand, and they started across the plank. They had almost reached the middle of it when Jack looked down. "Oh!" he said, and gave Margaret a pull. She looked down, too, and cried, "Oh, oh!" and down, down, down they went. Suddenly they landed with a thump. They sat up and rubbed their eyes. There they were, right in their own beds at home. Mother opened the door. "Are you awake, children?" she said. "Oh, Mother, we haven't been asleep. We've been to Santa Claus Land, and we nearly saw Santa Claus." Then they told her all about it, and Mother just smiled. End of section 198. Section 199 of Childhood's Favourites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Childhood's Favourites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 199. The Greedy Brownie. There was once a little Brownie who lived in a hollow tree stump. He had been busy all the day playing pranks. His pranks had taken him far away from home to the house of a very important laird. Into the laird's cup of wine he had dropped some sour berries which he had picked on his way. He also put thistles into his boots, so that when the laird had drawn them on, he had screamed out with pain. The Brownie had been away all the day, so that when at last he turned to go back to his home, he felt really very tired. On his way back to the wood, he passed by a cosy-looking farmhouse. The door of the dairy was open. The Brownie thought this would be a very nice cool place in which to rest for a few moments. So he slipped into the dairy and curled himself up underneath the bench to have a nice little doze. He was so weary that once he had fallen asleep he never woke up again until it was quite dark, when he was disturbed by two lassies who had come into the dairy. One was carrying a candle in her hand, and by its light the pair espied a big bowl of cream on the shelf. The naughty girls thought that they would drink it for supper. They could only find one spoon on the shelf, so they decided they would each have a spoonful in turn. Lassie Jean took the bowl and carried it to a bench in the corner, and Lassie Meg followed it with the candle. No sooner had the two girls settled themselves than the Brownie, who was now wide awake, and who was himself feeling that some supper might not be out of place, crept up behind them and blew out the candle. The lassies at first were very much concerned at being in the dark. Nevertheless, they determined they would drink the cream all the same. Lassie Jean filled the spoon with the rich delicacy. She was about to raise it to her lips when the naughty Brownie poked his head over her shoulder and lapped it out of the spoon before it had reached her mouth. Lassie Meg, believing that Lassie Jean had already swallowed some cream while she had had none, stretched out her hand to take away the spoon from her friend. Lassie Jean was not willing to give it up, since she said she had not yet tasted any cream. Lassie Meg was unwilling to believe her, for she declared she had heard her lapping the cream. Without waiting for Lassie Jean to explain, she snatched the spoon out of her friend's hand. She filled it with cream from the bowl, and was about to raise it to her lips when the Brownie jumped from behind Lassie Jean, and settling himself behind Lassie Meg's shoulders, poked forward his head and again lapped up the cream from out of the spoon. Lassie Jean, in her turn, snatched back the spoon from Lassie Meg. Thus they went on, for every time one or the other raised the spoonful of cream to her lips, it was lapped up by the Brownie. This continued until the bowl was emptied. The Brownie was full of cream, but the poor lassies had not so much as tasted one drop, although each believed the other had drunk it all. The lassies were still quarrelling when the door of the dairy was opened, and the farmer's wife entered, carrying a lighted candle in her hand. The moment that she did so the Brownie hopped under the bench, and the lassies started up guiltily. The farmer's wife caught sight of the empty basin. She was very angry with them indeed. When they tried hastily to explain, each blaming the other, the farmer's wife would not listen, but only grew the more angry. She told them that, since they had supped so well, they should have none of the scones and eggs which she had prepared for the evening meal in the kitchen. When the farmer's wife had entered, she had left the door open, so while she was busily scolding the lassies, the Brownie slipped out from under the bench and made his escape. As he ran chuckling down the road, he could still hear her angry voice drowning the attempted explanations of the bewildered lassies. When the little fellow curled himself up some time later in the tree trunk, he was still laughing. End of section 199. Section 200 of Childhood's Favourites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Childhood's Favourites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 200. The Fairies Passage by James Clarence Mangan. Tap, 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 rap. Get up, Gaffer Ferryman. Ah, who's there? The clock strikes 3. Get up, do, Gaffer. You are the very man we have been longing to see. The ferryman rises, growling and grumbling, and goes fumbling and stumbling and tumbling over the wares on his way to the door. But he sees no more than he saw before, till a voice is heard. "Oh, ferryman dear, here we are, waiting, all of us here. We are a wee colony, some 200 in all, or 3. Ferry us over the River Lee, dawn of day, and we will pay the most we may in our own wee way. Who are you? Whence came you? What place are you going to? Oh, we have dwelt over long in this land. The people get cross, and are growing so knowing too. Nothing at all, but they now understand. We are daily vanishing under the thunder of some huge engine or iron wonder. That iron, it has entered our souls. Your souls, oh girls, you queer little drolls. Do you mean? Good Gaffer, do aid us with speed, for our time, like our stature, is short indeed, and a very long way we have to go, 8 or 10,000 miles or so, hither and thither and to and fro, with our pots and pans and little gold cans. But our light caravans run swifter than man's." Well, you may come," said the ferryman affably. "Patrick, turn out and get ready the barge." Then again to the little folk, "Though you seem laughably small, I don't mind, if your coppers be large. Oh dear, what a rushing, what pushing, what crushing!" The watermen making vain efforts at hushing the hubbub the while. There followed these words: "What clapping of boards, what strapping of cords, what stowing away of children and wives, and platters and mugs, and spoons and knives," till all had safely got into the boat, and the ferryman, clad in his tip-top coat, and his wee little fairies were safely afloat. Then ding, 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 and cling, 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 how the coppers did ring in the tin pitcherling. Off then went the boat, at first very pleasantly, smoothly, and so forth, but after a while it swayed and it sagged this and that way, and presently chest after chest and pile after pile of the little folks' goods began tossing and rolling, and pitching like fun, beyond fairy controlling. Oh, ma'am, if the hubbub were great before, it was now some 2 or 3 million times more. Crush went the wee crocks, and the clocks, and the locks of each little wee box were stove in by hard knocks. And then there were oaths, and prayers, and cries, Take care, see there, oh dear, my eyes! I am killed, I am drowned, with groans and sighs, till to land they drew. Yo ho, pull to, till a rope throw and throw, and all's right anew. Now jump upon shore, ye queer little oddities. Eh, what is this? Where are they at all? Where are they, and where are they tiny commodities? Well, as I live, he looks blank as a wall, poor ferryman. Round him and round him he gazes, but only gets deeplier lost in the mazes of utter bewilderment. All are gone, and he stands alone, like a statue of stone. In a doldrum of wonder he turns to steer, and a tinkling laugh salutes his ear, with other odd sounds, ha ha, ha ha, pol-lol, zid-zizzle, queer, ba ba, fizzy-gig, giggity, sha-sha. Oh, ye thieves, ye rascally thieves! The good man cries, he turns to his pitcher, and there, alas, to his horror perceives that the little folks' mode of making him richer has been to pay him with withered leaves. End of section 200.
Section 201 of Charlotte's Favourites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Varra and Real. Charlotte's Favourites and Fairy Stories by various authors. The world. The world is wet, said the little frog. What is in water is mostly bog. Oh, not at all, said the little fly. It's full of spiders and very dry. The world is dark, said the moth polite, with ruddy windows and balls of light. My poor young friend, you've much to learn. The world is green, said the swaying fern. Oh, listen to me, sang the little lark. It's wet and dry and it's green and dark. To think that's all would be very wrong. It's arched with blue and it's filled with song. End of section number 201.
Section 202 of Childhood Favorites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Manuvox. Childhood Favorites and Fairy Stories. Various authors. Section 202. White Magic. Blind folks see the fairies, oh better far than we, who miss the shining of their wings, because our eyes are filled with things we do not wish to see. They need not seek enchantment from solemn printed books, for all about them as they go the fairies flutter to and fro, with smiling friendly looks. Deaf folk hear the fairies, however soft their song. 'Tis we who lose the honey sound, amid the clamour all around, that beats the whole day long. But they with gentle faces sit quietly apart. What room have they for sorrowing, while fairy minstrels sit and sing, close to each listening heart? End of section 202. Recording by Manuvox. End of Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories. Various authors.
Section 203 of Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 203. The Brownies by Juliana Horatio Ewing. 1. "Children are a burden," said the tailor as he sat on his bench stitching away. "Children are a blessing," said the kind lady in the window. It was the tailor's mother who spoke. She was a very old woman, and nearly helpless. All day she sat in a large armchair knitting rugs. "What have my two lads ever done to help me?" continued the tailor sadly. "They do nothing but play. If I send Tommy on an errand, he loiters. If I ask him to work, he does it so unwillingly that I would rather do it myself. Since their mother died, I have indeed had a hard time." At this moment the two boys came in, their arms full of moss, which they dropped on the floor. "Is there any supper, grandmother?" asked Tommy. "No, my child, only some bread for breakfast tomorrow." "Oh, grandmother, we are so hungry!" And the boy's eyes filled with tears. "What can I do for you, my poor children?" said the good woman. "Tell us a story, please, so we can forget we are hungry. Tell us about the brownie that used to live in your grandfather's house. What was he like?" "Like a little man, they say." "What did he do?" "He came early in the morning before anyone in the house was awake, and lighted the fire and swept the room and set out the breakfast. He never would be seen, and was off before they could catch him, but they often heard him laughing and playing about the house." "Did they give him any wages, grandmother?" "No, my dear, he did all the work for free. They always set a pan of clear water for him, and now and then a bowl of bread and milk." "Oh, grandmother, where did he go?" "The old owl in the wood knows. I do not. When I was young, many people used to go to see the old owl at moonrise, and ask her what they wanted to know." "How I wish a brownie would come and live with us!" cried Tommy. "So do I," said Johnny. "Will you let us set out a pan of water for the brownie, father?" asked Tommy. "You may set out what you like, my lads, but you must go to bed now." The boys brought out a pan of water. Then they climbed the ladder to the loft over the kitchen. Johnny was soon in the land of dreams, but Tommy lay awake thinking how he could find a brownie and get him to live in the house. "There is an owl that lives in the grove," he thought. "It may be the old owl herself. When the moon rises, I'll go and find her." 2. The moon rose like gold and went into the heavens like silver. Tommy opened his eyes and ran to the window. "The moon has risen," he said, "and it is time for me to go." Downstairs he crept softly and out into the still night. "Hoot, hoot!" cried a voice from the grove near the house. "That's the old owl," thought Tommy. He ran to a big tree and looked up. There he saw the old owl sitting on a branch and staring at him with yellow eyes. "Oh dear!" said Tommy, for he did not like the owl very well. "Come up here! Come up here!" she cried. Tommy climbed the tree and sat face to face with her on the big branch. "Now, "What do you want?" said the Owl. "Please," said Tommy, "I want to know where to find the brownie and how to get one to come and live with us." "Ooh, ooh," said the Owl. "That's it, is it? I know of 3 brownies." "Hooray!" said Tommy. "Where do they live?" "In your house," said the Owl. "In our house? Whereabouts? Why don't they work?" cried Tommy. "One of them is too little," said the Owl. "But why don't the other 2 do something?" said Tommy. "Nobody does any work at our house except Father." "They are idle, said the old Owl. "Then we don't want them," said Tommy. "What is the use of having brownies in the house if they do nothing to help us?" "Perhaps they don't know what to do." "I wish you would tell me where to find them," said Tommy. "I could tell them what to do." "Could you? Ooh, ooh." And Tommy could not tell whether the Owl was hooting or laughing. "Of course I could. They might get up early in the morning and sweep the house and light the fire and spread the table before my father comes downstairs." "So they might," said the Owl. "Well, I can tell you where to find one of the brownies, and he can tell you where to find his brother. Go to the north side of the pond, where the moon is shining on the water. Turn yourself about 3 times while you say this charm. Twist me and turn me and show me the elf. I looked in the water and saw. Then look in the water and think of a word which rhymes with elf, and make the charm complete." Tommy knew the place very well. He ran to the north side of the pond and turned himself about 3 times. He repeated the charm. Then he looked in and saw himself. "Why, there's no one but myself. I can't think of the right word. What can it be? I'll go back and ask the old owl," thought Tommy. And back he went. There sat the owl as before. "Woo-hoo!" said she, as Tommy climbed up. "Did you find out the word?" "No," said Tommy. "I could find no word that rhymes with elf except myself." "Well, that is the word. Now, do you know where your brother is?" "In the bed, in the loft," said Tommy. "Then all your questions are answered. Good night." And the old owl began to shake her feathers. "Don't go yet," said Tommy humbly. "I don't understand you. I am not a brownie, am I?" "Yes, you are, and a very idle one too," said the old owl. "All children are brownies." "But are there really any brownies except children?" inquired Tommy in a dismal tone. "No, there are not. Now listen to me, Tommy. Little people can do only little things. When they are idle and mischievous, they are called boggarts, and they are a burden to the house they live in. When they are thoughtful, and useful. They are brownies and are a blessing to everyone." "I'll be a brownie," said Tommy. "I won't be a boggart. Now I'll go home and tell Johnny." "I'll take you home," said the Owl, and in a moment Tommy found himself in bed, with Johnny sleeping by his side. "How quickly we came," said Tommy to himself. "But is it morning? That is very strange. I thought the moon was shining. Come, Johnny, get up. I have a story to tell you." 3. While his brother was rubbing his eyes, Tommy told him of his visit to the old owl in the grove. "Is that all true?" asked Tommy. "It is all just as I tell you. And if we don't want to be boggarts, we must get up and go to work." "I won't be a boggart," said Johnny, and so the two brownies crept softly down the ladder into the kitchen. "I will light the fire," said Tommy, "and you, Johnny, can dig some potatoes to roast for breakfast." They swept the room and laid the table. Just as they were putting the potatoes in a dish, they heard footsteps. "There's Father," said Tommy. "We must run." The poor tailor came wearily down the stairs. Morning after morning he had found an untidy room and an empty table. But now, when he entered the kitchen, he looked around in great surprise. He put his hand out to the fire to see if it was really warm. He touched the potatoes and looked at the neat room. Then he shouted, "Mother! Mother! Boys! Boys! The brownie has come!" There was great excitement in the small house, but the boys said nothing. All day the tailor talked about the brownie. "I have heard of little people," he said, "but this is wonderful, to come and do the work for a pan of cold water. Who would have believed it?" The boys said nothing until they were both in bed. Then Tommy said, "The old owl was right, and we must stick to the work if we don't want to be boggarts. But I don't like to have Father thinking that we are still idle. I wish he knew that we are the brownies." "So do I," said Johnny. Day after day went by, and still the boys rose early, and each day they found more and more to do. The brownies were the joy of the tailor's life. One day a messenger came for the tailor to go to a farmhouse several miles away. The farmer gave him an order for a suit of clothes and paid him at once. Full of joy at his good fortune, he hurried home. As he came near the house, he saw that the garden had been weeded. "It's the brownie," he said, "and I shall make a suit of clothes for him." "If you make clothes for the brownie, he will leave the house," said the grandmother. "Not if the clothes are a good fit, mother. I shall measure them by Tommy, for they say that brownies are about his size." At last a fine new suit with brass buttons was finished and laid out for the brownie. "Don't the clothes look fine?" said Tommy when he came down in the morning. "I'll try them on." The tailor rose earlier than usual that day, for he wished to catch a glimpse of the brownie. he went softly downstairs. There was Johnny sweeping the floor, and Tommy trying on the new suit. "What does this mean?" shouted the father. "It's the brownies," said the boys. "This is no joke," cried the tailor angrily. "Where are the real brownies, I say?" "We are the only brownies, father," said Tommy. "I can't understand this. Who has been sweeping the kitchen lately, I should like to know?" "We have," said the boys. "Who gets breakfast and put things in order?" "We do! We do!" they cried. "But when do you do it?" "Early in the morning, before you come down." "But if you do the work, where is the brownie?" "Here!" cried the boys. "We are the brownies, and we are sorry that we were boggarts so long." The father was delighted to find how helpful his boys had become. The grandmother, however, could hardly believe that a real brownie had not been in the house. But as she sat in her chair day after day, watching the boys at their work, she often repeated her favorite saying, "Children are a blessing." End of the brownies. End of section 203.
Section 204 of Childhood's Favourites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Julie van Wallichem. Childhood's Favourites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 204. The Story of Peter Pan. Once upon a time, there were 3 children named Wendy, John, and Michael, who lived with their father and mother in London. One evening, the father and mother were invited to a party, and the mother, after lighting the dim lamp in the nursery and kissing them good night, went away. That evening a little boy climbed in through the window, whose name was Peter Pan. He was a curious little fellow, very conceited, very forgetful, and yet very lovable. The most remarkable thing about him was that he never grew up. There came flitting in through the window with him his fairy, whose name was Tinker Bell. Peter Pan woke all the children up, and after he had sprinkled fairy dust on their shoulders, he took them away to the Neverland, where he lived with a family of lost boys. Tinker Bell was jealous of the little girl Wendy, and she hurried ahead of Peter Pan and persuaded the boys that Wendy was a bird who might do them harm, and so one of the boys shot her with his bow and arrow. When Peter Pan came and found Wendy lying lifeless upon the ground in the woods, he was very angry, but he was also very quick-witted. So he told the boys that if they would build a house around Wendy, he was sure that she would be better. So they hurried to collect everything they had out of which they could make a house. Though she was not yet strong enough to talk, they thought perhaps she might sing the kind of house she would like to have. So Wendy sang softly this little verse. "I wish I had a pretty house, the littlest ever seen, with funny little red walls and a roof of mossy green." When the house was done, Peter Pan took John's hat for the chimney, and the little house was so pleased to have such a capital chimney that smoke at once began to come out through the hat. All that night Peter Pan walked up and down in front of Wendy's house to watch over her and keep her from danger while she slept. All these children lived in an underground cave, and the next day, when Wendy got well,
They all went down into the cave, and Wendy agreed to be their mother and Peter their father. They had many good times together. They also had some exciting adventures with the Redskins and with a pirate named Captain Hook and his crew. After a time, the Redskins became their friends, and Peter rescued his family from the pirate ship. One day, Wendy and her brothers realized that they had been away so long that perhaps their mother had forgotten them and shut the window of the nursery so that they could not get back. They decided to hurry home. When they reached home, Peter Pan was before them, and he closed the window so that they could not get back. But when he heard the children's mother singing such a sad song inside, his heart was made tender, and he opened the window, and the children crept back safely into their mother's arms. Wendy's mother invited Peter Pan to stay and be her child, but Peter was so afraid that he would have to go to school and grow up and be a man that he went back to his home in Fairyland. Wendy promised to go once a year and stay a few days with Peter Pan and clean house and mend his clothes. Let us picture them in the little house that was built for Wendy, which the fairies had put up in the branches of a pine tree. The birds are singing in their nests and in the branches, and far below the clouds you can see the land and the sea. Wendy is sewing for Peter, and Peter Pan is playing his pipes while she works. When night comes, the woods are full of flashing lights like little stars, because the fairies are flitting around the house where Peter and Wendy live, and are singing to them as they go to sleep. In a few days, Wendy will go back to John and Michael to tell them what a good time she had on her visit in the little house in the woods. End of section 204.
Section 205 of Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 205 Sir Lark and King Sun by George MacDonald. Good morrow, my lord. In the sky alone sang the lark as the sun ascended his throne. Shine on me, my lord, I only have come of all your servants to welcome you home. I have flown right up a whole hour, I swear, to catch the first shine of your golden hair. Must I thank you then, said the king, Sir Lark, for flying so high and hating the dark? You ask a full cup for half a thirst, half for love of me, half love to be first. As many a bird makes no such haste, but waits till I come, that's as much to my taste. And King Sun hid his head in a turban of cloud, and Sir Lark stopped singing, quite vexed and cowed. But he flew up higher and thought, anon the wrath of the king will be over and gone, and his crown shining out of its cloudy fold will change my brown feathers to a glory of gold. So he flew, with the strength of a lark he flew, but as he rose the cloud rose too, and not one gleam of the golden hair came through the depths of the misty air, till weary with flying, with sighing sore, the strong sun-seeker could do no more. His wings had had no chrism of gold, and his feathers felt withered and worn and old. He faltered and sank, and dropped like a stone, and there on his nest, where he left her alone, sat his little wife on her little eggs, keeping them warm with wings and legs. Did I say alone? Ah, no such thing! Full in her face was shining the king. "Welcome, Sir Lark, you look tired," said he. "Up is not always the best way to me. While you have been singing so high and away, I've been shining to your little wife all day." He had set his crown all about the nest, and out of the midst shone her little brown breast. And so glorious was she in a russet of gold, that for wonder and awe Sir Lark grew cold. He popped his head under her wing, and lay as still as a stone till King Sun was away. End of section 205.
Section 206 of Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Stearns. Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 206. The Imps in the Heavenly Meadow by Kate E. Bunce, after Rudolf Bonbach. To heaven's meadows, bright with flowers and sunshine, the little children go, when they have had enough of life's sad dreaming and leave the earth below. But as they had not time to learn their lessons before they went away, there is a school where all the angel children must work 4 hours a day. With golden pencils upon silver tablets they copy fairy tales, and learn to keep their halos bright and shining, and sing and play their scales. And twice a week they glide with merry laughter all down the Milky Way, and homeward in the evening wander softly upon a sunset ray. But Sunday is the day they love and long for, then all the children go, and play from morn till night within a meadow where flowers in thousands grow. The meadow is not green, but blue and golden, the flowers like dewdrops bright. When it is night, they burn and glow and glisten, men call them stars of light. Through heaven's gate they all must pass to find it, where Peter with the key keeps watch and warns the little angels kindly how good they all must be. They must not fly about or run too quickly, nor go too far away, and when upon his golden key he calls them, then they must all obey. One day it was so very hot in heaven that good St. Peter slept, and when the little angel children saw it, away they quickly crept. Ah, then they ran and flew about with laughter, and fluttered far and wide. So far they wandered that of heaven's meadow, they reached the other side. They came to where the strong, tall, wooden paling shuts all that place away, where idle, careless, mischief-loving, naughty, the imps of darkness stray. And there the angels stopped, devoutly wishing some opening there might be, so that they might each one in turn peep through it and see what they could see. But not a chink or hole for all their seeking, no gleam of light pierced through, so with their little wings outspread and eager, right to the top they flew. And looking down they saw with awe and wonder imps all as black as soot. Each had 2 horns and each a tail to play with, and hoof instead of foot. They heard the rustle of angel feathers, they felt the cool sweet air, and lifting up their little coal-black faces, they saw heaven's children there. Then with one voice they cried, "Oh, angel children, you look so good and fair, we pray you let us come up into heaven and play a little there. We will not tweak nor pull your shining feathers, but be so very good. We will not try and steal your halos, but all do as we should." Then quick they flew away for Jacob's ladder, Peter was still asleep, and placed it safely where from heaven to Impland the way was dark and steep. Then every imp, with shouts of laughter, helped by an angel's hand, scrambled right over the great wooden paling, and stood in heaven's land. They all, with airs sedate and pious faces, discreetly walked around, their tails like trains upon their arms upholding, and eyes upon the ground. The little angels fluttered round in rapture, and showed the lovely flowers, and bade them listen to the thrilling voices of birds in heaven's bowers, and gently led them by the crystal streamlets, bade them on dewdrops feast, and showed them where the silver moon was rising, to light them from the east. Alas, when all the little demons saw her, the moon so large and round, they all began to roar, and growl, and gibber, and leap from off the ground, and mocked the great white moon with ugly faces, turned somersaults in air, and when the angels prayed them cease, in terror, they vowed they did not care. They trampled down the grass in heaven's meadow, they tore the flowers about, and flung them on the earth beyond the paling, with jibe and jeer and shout. They chased the birds that sang among the tree-tops, and hushed their music sweet. They pulled the angels' tender feathers, and trod upon their feet. Then to the good St. Peter cried the angels, to help them in their pain, and if he would but this one time forgive them, they would be good again. Then rose St. Peter from his peaceful dreaming, an angry saint was he. He wrung his hands, and clasped his head in horror, and seized his golden key. Then blew a mighty blast in wrath upon it, back all the angels flew, and wide he threw the door of heaven open, and thrust the children through. And then he called 2 great and powerful angels, the strongest of the race, to chase the little demons out of heaven, and clear the holy place. They gathered up the little imps in armfuls, bore them with mighty stride, and flung them over the strong wooden paling, down the other side. And though they fought and lashed their tails and whimpered, and kicked with might and main, to heaven's meadow, bright with sun and flowers, they never came again. For 2 long months the little angel children were not allowed to play before the door of heaven in the meadow, but stayed in all the day. And when again they sought the heavenly meadow, each child with humble mind must lay astride its little shining halo, and leave its wings behind. But all the flowers that on that day of sorrow flung out and scattered were, took root and bloom again in earth's green meadows, as daisies white and fair. End of 206. The Imps in the Heavenly Meadow. Recorded by Jennifer Stearns, Concord, New Hampshire.
Section 207 of Childhood's Favourites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Joseph Finkberg. Childhood's Favourites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 207. The Birthday Honours of the Fairy Queen by Hapgood Moore. Once upon a time there lived in Green Erin a little girl by the name of Nora. Her home was a small thatched cottage of stone beside the brae at the foot of a mountain, in the midst of a woodland so deep that in the summer-time, when the trees were full, the sun got its rays inside but a few hours of the day, and you could see of the stardust that covers the fields of the sky no piece larger than the palm of your hand. It was a famous meeting place for the fairies, this haunt at the foot of the mountain by the stream, for the little folk from the heather above used nightly to foregather in the meadow with the little folk from the woodlands below, and there they danced the long night through among the shamrocks. But although Nora had heard about the fairies from her grandmother, who sat all day tending the peat fire, and something more about them from her mother, when of an evening after supper she had time to speak to Nora of herself when she was a girl, yet Nora had never in all her life set eyes upon one of these feasters of the forest. For the fairies, mind you, come only to 2 kinds of folk, to those who believe in them and to those who need them. Now Nora believed in the fairies all right, but she had never been in need of them until now, at this time that I'm telling you of. Now, this same Nora was one of these lasses that is a wee bit gloomery. And you don't know what this same gloomery is? Well, She was at times hindered by a rainy morning disposition, so it was plain enough to the fairies that she was in some need of them. One day Nora went into the deep of the wildwood, a few steps below her mother's cottage, to a trysting place, where she often resorted when she had the time from her daily duties. She had been unusually heckled that morning, as all of us are at times, by being obliged to do many things for which she had little liking. The spot was a favourite one of Nora's. There was a shelter of rocks above, almost like a cave or roof, and below there was a tiny stream of water that ran out of a spring in the back of the hill and sang its way down the slopes to the brae below. In this pool Nora nearly always laid some field flowers, because they kept fresher there than anywhere else. From the low seat that Nora had made out of a stone in the back of a shelter, she looked out into a sunny place in the woods, around which stood, as if they were pillars of a woodland palace, 6 grey beeches. Now, upon this sunny afternoon that I'm speaking of, hardly had Nora reclined upon a bench, feeling a bit drowsy, no doubt, with the heat, yet not quite sleepy, listening to a robin singing with the voice of Eden, when she heard a light tapping on the wall of the largest beech, the one that was nearest to the place where she was lying. At first, when she heard this sound, she thought that it was the robin redbreast that she had noticed hopping up and down in the open place in the sunlight, and yet she knew well that robins do not drum upon the bark of trees like woodpeckers. So she jumped lightly up and ran to the tree, and at once she was aware that the tapping was from inside the tree, and between the taps that were no louder than those of a branch against a window pane, she distinctly heard a very tiny voice. How tiny was the voice, Michael Arun? You're asking me how tiny the voice was. Let me see if I can tell you. You've heard the sound of the rivulet when it falls upon the mossy stones in the pasture by the barway? Well, it was about as loud as the echo of that if you should walk 30 paces away and then listen. So Nora had to put her ear up close against the breast of the beech tree, and even then the voice sounded no louder than the sound of a beech leaf when it falls from a branch into the moss bed. But she could hear what the voice was saying, and it was these words: Nora, my darling, turn the key and let me out. Nora looked around in amazement, but sure enough, there on the breast of the beech, about the height of her heart, was a small key of the colour of the bark that she had never noticed before, even though she had hugged that beech tree every morning of her life. So Nora turned the key at once, and out stepped a fairy, Michael. Yeah, better than a fairy, a dryad. That is a fairy of the tree, for a fairy of a tree is as much higher in rank than a fairy of the meadow as a duchess is than a goose girl. She was about the size of the robin redbreast, and was dressed all in green, except a lovely cloak of red that, when it was folded about her, made her look very much indeed like the redbreast himself, and she was no bit bigger than the robin either. Nora Mavournain, said the dryad, I have been noticing that you seem a bit sad-hearted of late, and for no reason either that anybody knows. So if you don't mind, I will take you with me for a walk this afternoon through Fairyland, and we will see if we cannot do something to restore your good spirits again. At these words Nora danced for joy, and you would never have been able to guess that she had ever known a downhearted moment. So the dryad clapped her tiny hands 3 times, and out of the open door in the beech tree stepped a little gnome who came and bowed low before them, holding in his hands a silver salver on which lay a little pellet. How little was the pellet, uncle? Well, what would you say if I told you that it was as small as a hummingbird's egg? Oh, you think it was smaller than that? Well, how about the seed of a coriander? No? Then I will tell you the truth. It was as small as the gnat that gets into your eye, that feels as big as a rat. So Nora took the pellet from the platter and thanked the gnome kindly, and she ate it down. And no sooner had she swallowed it than she was no bigger than the dryad herself. So the dryad took her by the hand, and they walked gaily into the beech tree door, and the door shut behind them. They went down and down a lot of winding stairs that were lighted only by small windows in the bark of the tree that Nora had never noticed before and could never find afterward. It was very cool and pleasant, for they could hear the sap go singing on its way from the roots up to the branches and leaves, and when a summer shower went by, they could hear the raindrops as they went singing down the trunk outside to the roots. After they had reached the foot of the stairs, they walked for a long way through a cool corridor. It was not quite dark, for little people stood at every turn who seemed to be doing what fireflies do on summer nights in the grass, and each one whistling to himself as he held his softly shaded lantern aloft. Down the side passages, Nora could see thousands of tiny miners at work, and what do you think they are doing? Digging for gold and diamonds. They were tending the woodland plants that hang their golden blossoms in the pathways, and carrying up the dewdrops that sparkle like diamonds from their leaves in the daybreak. And it was pleasant to see them work, for they were all singing. By and by, Nora and the dryad came to a place where there was a brighter light ahead, and as they drew nearer, Nora could see that they had come to the bank of the pond that is below Nora's cottage, only that they were under the surface, looking up through a light so soft that it cast no shadows. And now the dryad took Nora's hand, and she found herself in a little boat, no bigger than a leaf, sailing across the pond, but still beneath its surface. And here she saw on every hand, working amid the mire and the murk, such jolly little divers who were feeding the fish and tending the pond lily roots, and like all the others, singing at their tasks. Now, you will know, of course, that they were on their way to the home of the Fairy Queen, and it was but a short while before they were there. I need not tell you, children, how lovely is her palace, with its golden floor and silver walls, and its hangings of the colours of the rainbow. Nor need I say how beautiful is her Majesty herself, with wings like the most splendid butterfly, and a gown like the morning, and a face like the sunshine. It seems that Nora had come upon the Queen's birthday, and she was just giving the birthday honours. So Nora and the dryad stood in the background and watched the scene. Around the throne stood gallant fairy gentlemen, clad like beetles and dragonflies for splendour, and ladies whose long gowns hung like the light on the waterfall of Loughmarine. But to the amazement of Nora, those who came forward to receive the honours were for the most part dressed like workmen, and many of them were bent with hard labour. As each advanced and made obeisance, the royal herald read the exploit for which the rank of knighthood was about to be conferred. For one he read, "To our faithful servant who covered the lilies of Moira from the attack of the Frost King," and to another, "To the gallant yeoman who watered the grain field of Kilvellin," and to still another, "To him who dug the trench by the roadside and kept safe the highway to Throstlewaite Fair." And as each came forward, the trumpets pealed in triumph, and after a gold star had been pinned upon the new knight's breast, the gentlemen and ladies of the court greeted them with hearty reverence, and Nora looked in the smiling face of the dryad, but said nothing. Then Nora herself, in a breathless moment of fear, was presented to the Queen, and the Queen kissed her daintily just above her lips on both sides, and suddenly Nora found herself back on her stony bench by the spring, with the branches of the beech tree waving silently before her. "Oh, Mothereen and Grandmotherkin!" she cried as soon as she got home, and she ran home all the way. "Let me tell you about the wonderful visit I've been making out in the wildwood." And after she had told her story, Mothereen said, "I think Nora has been dreaming." But Grandmotherkin said, "No, daughter, I think our little Acushla has had her eyes opened the day." Then Nora in triumph showed the 2 dimples where the fairy queen had kissed her. And do you know, my darlings, I cannot but think that she told the truth after all. For ever after, if one kissed Nora upon these 2 dimples, or even touched them, or even looked at them, she would break into the sweetest smile, and she never was gloomering or lowering any more. End of section 207. End of Childhood's Favourites and Fairy Stories by various authors.